Hello everyone, I am the Creeps Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Delivering hot tubs is a job that has taken me to some strange places, but nothing had prepared me for this house. It was a massive, half-built mansion tucked away in a fancy gated community near Branson, Missouri. The kind of place that felt too expensive for anyone I knew to ever afford. It had that fresh construction smell, with dust, wet cement, the sharp bite of insulation. Big trucks were parked all around, guys in hard hats moving back and forth, cutting boards, hammering, yelling to each other over the noise of saws. The whole place was alive with work. I pulled my truck into the driveway and stepped out, stretching my back from the long drive. The house itself was built into the side of a hill, but the way it was designed made it feel backwards. From where I stood in the driveway, I was level with what they called the fourth floor. The other 3 floors stretched down the hillside, looking out over a steep drop-off. You wouldn't know it from standing at the front, but the back of the house had nothing but air beneath it. The contractor came up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He gave me a quick rundown. The hot tub was going up on the 4th floor balcony, which was technically ground level from my perspective. Problem was, the deck wasn't finished yet. They had only laid down just enough boards to create a narrow walkway leading from the back patio doors to the far corner where the tub would sit. No railing, no extra flooring, just an open, unfinished skeleton of a deck with a 4-story drop on the other side. I've been in sketchy situations before, but this was next level. A 900-pound hot tub, a half-built deck, and a straight drop into a pile of boulders if something went wrong. But this was my job. I'd done crazy deliveries before, and if I didn't do it, who else was going to? The construction crew was eager to help, which was good because there was no way I was doing this alone. We unloaded the tub from my trailer, balancing it upright on the dolly. Moving hot tubs isn't like moving a couch or a fridge. These things are huge, unwieldy, and every bit of their weight fights against you. Even on a dolly, they have a mind of their own. We had to get it from the driveway, down into the yard, then up a ramp to the porch, through the living room, and out onto the deck. That was the easy part. The real challenge would be getting it settled into place on that tiny, unfinished section of the deck without tipping it, or me over the edge. We rolled it carefully through the house, my hands sweating despite the cool air. Everything felt fine until we hit the back doors, and I got my first real look at the deck. My stomach clenched. It was worse than I expected. The deck was a patchwork of planks, gaps wide enough to see all the way down. The section we needed to cross was only a few feet wide. It stretched like a bridge to the far corner where the tub would sit. No railing, no extra room to maneuver. Just a handful of planks keeping me from falling 4 stories onto the jagged rocks below. I swallowed hard. The crew didn't seem bothered, but then again, they weren't the ones rolling a 900-pound hot tub across this death trap. We inched the tub forward, my boots scuffing against the planks as we carefully rolled it over the threshold. Every movement felt like it had to be perfect. One slip, one wrong shift in weight, and it was game over. When we finally got it into position, I had to stand at the very edge of the deck to lower it down. Normally, this is a controlled process. You ease the tub down, guide it with the strap, and everything stays balanced. But this wasn't normal. There was no room for error. The contractor wanted to leave the tub standing upright, which made things 10 times harder. To get the dolly out from under it, I needed to tilt the tub, meaning I had to shift my feet back a few inches. Only problem was I was already standing at the edge of the deck. There was no more deck behind me, just air. I told everyone to hold still. I needed a second to adjust. My boots edged back, heels hanging off, my whole body tense as I tried not to think about the drop. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. We were almost there. The dolly was halfway free. Just a few more seconds. Then, without warning, one of the workers got impatient. He kicked the corner of the tub to dislodge it from the dolly. The moment his foot connected, I felt it. The shift. The loss of control. I shouted, but it was too late. The weight of the tub lurched forward, pulling me with it. My heels slipped, and suddenly, there was nothing beneath me. I was falling. Time slowed down. I could see the ground below, the jagged rocks waiting for me. My arms flailed, my body twisted, every muscle in me screaming to grab onto something. But there was nothing. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something slam into the small of my back. It wasn't the ground. It wasn't the tub. It was stopping me. A second later, I was yanked forward, my chest smacking hard against the side of the tub. My fingers dug into the edge, heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I wasn't falling anymore. It took a second to realize what had happened. The strap. The useless guy, the one who had been playing with the strap instead of helping, had already secured one end to the house. When I fell, it was hanging just behind me. He saw me go, grabbed the loose end, and pulled it tight with every ounce of strength he had. It caught me just in time, stopping my fall and slamming me back into the tub instead of open air. The other guys rushed forward, grabbing me, steadying the tub, pulling me back to solid ground. My legs felt like jelly. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. The guy who saved me was standing there, still gripping the strap, his face white as a sheet. He hadn't meant to save my life. He had just been playing with the strap. But in that 1 second, that mindless little action became the only reason I was still alive. I don't remember much about finishing the delivery. The guys strapped the tub down. I made sure it was secure. But my mind was somewhere else. I kept seeing the drop, kept feeling the air under my feet, kept thinking about how close I had come to dying. I could have fallen. I should have fallen. And if I had, there wouldn't have been a hospital visit or a lucky break. It would have been over. A 4-story drop onto boulders doesn't leave room for second chances. That night, I sat in my truck for a long time before heading home. I kept replaying it all, the way it happened, the way it could have ended differently. And the only thing I could think of was how I needed to thank the guy who saved me. I had been saving up for a vacation, a surprise trip for my wife and daughter to Breckenridge, Colorado. But in that moment, I knew there was someone else who deserved it more. The next day, I gave him the tickets, sent him, his wife, and his kid on a fully paid vacation for Christmas. He hadn't asked for anything. He didn't even expect a thank you. But he got to spend Christmas in the mountains with his family, and I got to spend Christmas alive. That was the scariest moment of my life. And to this day, I still don't stand too close to the edge of anything. I was 7 years old when I came the closest to dying. It wasn't a car crash or some freak accident. It wasn't sickness or drowning. It was dirt. Just dirt. My brothers and I had been playing all morning in an area that people used as an unofficial motocross track. The place was a mess, tire tracks everywhere, deep grooves in the dirt, little hills made from jumps that the bikers had carved out over time. It wasn't an actual park, no rules or anything, just a place where people came with their dirt bikes and tore the ground apart. To us, it was the perfect playground. That day, we got the idea to dig a tunnel. There was no real reason for it, just something to do. We had sticks, our hands, and a couple of small shovels we had found. The dirt was loose, soft enough to dig into without too much effort. It was one of those dumb ideas kids have, the kind that seems completely harmless until it's too late. We didn't know anything about tunnels. We didn't think about how dirt works, how it shifts, how it doesn't just stay where you want it to stay. We just started digging. For hours, we worked at it, taking turns scraping away at the earth, kicking out loose soil. The tunnel got deeper and deeper, about 6 feet in and 2 feet high. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like an achievement. We were stupidly proud of it. I was the one who crawled in the farthest. My brothers were outside, standing near the entrance, probably talking about making it bigger, maybe even making more tunnels. But I was inside, right up at the front, hands in the dirt, thinking about how much further I could go. That's when it happened. The tunnel collapsed. It wasn't slow. It wasn't a little trickle of dirt giving me a warning. It was instant. 1 second, I was staring into the darkness ahead of me. The next, the whole world came crashing down. Everything went black. At first, I didn't understand what had happened. I couldn't see. I couldn't hear anything except the muffled, crushing sound of dirt shifting around me. It was hot, furnace hot. The weight of the soil pressed against every inch of my body, squeezing me, locking me in place. I tried to move, but I couldn't. Panic hit me all at once. I opened my mouth to scream, but dirt filled it before any sound could come out. It got into my nose, my throat, choking me instantly. I coughed, but that only made it worse. The dirt didn't move, it just pressed harder. My lungs burned. I couldn't take a deep breath. Every inhale pulled in more dust, more dirt, making me cough more, making me panic more. I thrashed, or at least I tried to. My hands were near my face, but I couldn't move them. The weight was too much. It was everywhere, crushing me from all sides. And then the heat. It wasn't just warm. It felt like my skin was on fire. The air, if you could even call it that, was thick, dry, and boiling. My whole body was sweating, but the sweat had nowhere to go. It just stuck to me, mixing with the dirt, turning into this thick, suffocating layer that clung to my skin. Then the darkness started to change. At first, it was just black, but then it turned red. Deep, dark red, like blood behind my eyes. The pressure in my head was unbearable, like something was trying to squeeze my skull from the inside. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, getting louder and louder, faster and faster. I thought I was going to hell. I was 7 years old, and my mind couldn't make sense of what was happening. The heat, the red, the suffocation, it didn't feel like just dirt. It felt like I had already died and was being dragged somewhere else, somewhere terrible. I wanted to scream again, but I couldn't. There was no air left to scream with. My chest felt like it was caving in. My stomach clenched so hard it hurt. Every muscle in my body was locked in place, frozen under the weight of the earth. I don't know how long I was in there. Time didn't feel real anymore. It could have been seconds, minutes, hours. It felt like forever. My body stopped fighting. My mind started to slip. And then, something grabbed my foot. At first, I didn't even register it. I thought I was imagining things. But then I felt it again, pressure movement. Something pulling at me. The dirt around my legs shifted. Light, faint but real, broke through the suffocating darkness. Then, all at once, I was being yanked backward. I felt the dirt scrape against my face, my arms, my chest as my brothers dragged me out. It felt like being ripped from a grave. My body was so stiff, so weak, I couldn't do anything to help them. I just let them pull me. And then I was out. The air hit me like a slap. Cool, fresh, real air. My lungs seized up for a second before I gasped so hard I thought my chest would burst. I coughed, choking on the dirt still in my throat, hacking it up in thick, dry clumps. My whole body was shaking. My skin was coated in a layer of dust, sweat, and filth. My eyes stung. My mouth was dry and tasted like soil. I could hear my brothers breathing hard, see their hands covered in dirt. They had been digging like maniacs, clawing through the collapse to get to me. They didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We just stood there for a while. Then, without a word, we left. We never told our parents. We never talked about it much after that. We just went home, got hosed down, and acted like nothing had happened. But I never forgot. Because for those few moments, buried under the earth, burning, suffocating, trapped in the red darkness, I truly believed I was dead. I was walking up the hall at work when it happened. I wasn't in a hurry, wasn't distracted, wasn't doing anything unusual, just walking. The hallway was familiar. I had walked it 100 times before, maybe more. It was a standard office building hallway, nothing special about it. Beige walls, low-pile gray carpet, evenly spaced doors leading to offices on either side. The lighting was artificial and flat, the same as every other workday. I had just rounded a corner, my mind on something else, when my heel slipped and everything changed. It didn't feel like a fall. I didn't crash to the floor or trip over anything. My foot just seemed to betray me, slipping forward while the rest of me kept moving. My leg twisted beneath me, bending at an angle that didn't feel natural, but I didn't hit the ground. Instinct took over, and instead of collapsing, I lowered myself down, putting weight on my hands as I eased onto the carpet. Something felt wrong. It wasn't pain at first, more like a deep, uncomfortable awareness. A wrongness in my leg, like something inside it had shifted in a way it wasn't supposed to. I froze for a moment, trying to process it, my body's natural reaction keeping me still as my brain caught up. That's when I heard it, the sound that changed everything. A loud, wet crunch. It wasn't a sharp snap like a twig breaking. It was deeper, thicker, like stepping on a bundle of dry branches wrapped in something soft. The sound came from inside me, from my own body. For a second, I thought maybe something outside had made the noise, that maybe I had just imagined it. But I knew. Then the pain hit. It didn't start slow. It came all at once, a deep, crushing ache that spread through my lower leg like fire, radiating from the spot where something inside me had given way. It wasn't the kind of pain that made you gasp or scream. It was deeper than that, sinking into my bones, making my stomach twist. I still hadn't looked down. I became aware of movement from the corner of my eye. The office door nearest to me opened, and a woman stepped out. I barely registered who she was at first. My focus was narrowing, my body trying to shut everything else out. But I saw her expression shift the moment she looked at me. Confusion at first, then something worse. I didn't realize what had drawn her out of her office until later. She had heard the sound, the crunch, that awful, unnatural noise my body had made when my fibula gave way. She didn't say anything. I could see it in her face. Whatever she had expected to see when she stepped into the hallway, it wasn't this. She just stared at me, her eyes flicking between my face and my leg, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. I knew then that it must have been bad. I finally forced myself to look down. My leg wasn't at the angle it should have been. It hadn't snapped all the way through, hadn't folded in half or anything dramatic, but something beneath the skin had shifted in a way that was unmistakable. My foot didn't line up quite right. There was a new bend in my shin, a curve that shouldn't have been there. I exhaled, slow and shaky. My hands were clammy. The pain was building now, rising with each second, wrapping itself around my nerves and digging in. My stomach churned, my body trying to decide whether to panic or shut down. The woman was still staring. She had gone pale, her hands gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles had turned white. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes wide and locked onto my leg. Then she backed away. It wasn't a conscious movement, more like an instinctive retreat. Like she had seen something she wasn't supposed to, something her brain didn't know how to process. She disappeared back into her office for a moment, and I heard the sound of her chair scraping against the floor as she sat down heavily. I focused on my breathing. In, out. The pain wasn't sharp, it was thick and deep, a grinding pressure in my shin that made my whole body tense. The worst part was knowing what had happened. Bones aren't supposed to break like that, not from just walking. But mine had. I tried to move my foot, just a little, and nausea rolled through me. The hallway felt too quiet now. I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy and uneven, each beat sending another wave of pain through my leg. I wasn't sure how much time passed before someone else found me. Maybe a minute, maybe longer. I remember the feeling of the carpet beneath my hands, the way my breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I remember the fluorescent lights overhead, how sterile and artificial they seemed, how they made everything feel surreal, like I wasn't really there. By the time help arrived, the woman was still in her office. She hadn't left. She couldn't. I didn't see her reaction when they lifted me, when they moved my leg, and the pain hit a new level. I was too busy trying not to pass out. But I heard later that she had stayed at her desk, staring at nothing, her hands still gripping the arms of her chair like she was afraid to let go. She never talked to me about it afterward. I came back to work after my leg healed. The pain had faded, the worst of it behind me. But something had changed. Not for me, for her. She avoided me. Not in an obvious way, not at first. But I noticed. She wouldn't make eye contact when we passed in the hall. If I walked into a room where she was, she would find a reason to leave. I caught her looking at me once, just a glance, but there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Then I heard from someone else that she had been having nightmares. Nightmares about the sound. That awful, sickening crunch. She had been right there when it happened. She had heard it, and now it wouldn't leave her. It had sunk into her mind the same way the pain had sunk into my leg, deep and inescapable. I had broken my fibula, but I had broken something in her, too. I don't know why the upstairs of my grandparents' house has always scared me. Maybe it's because no one ever really goes up there, and anything untouched for too long starts to feel wrong. Maybe it's because as a kid, I overheard stories I wasn't supposed to, about things other people had seen up there, things that didn't make sense. Or maybe it's just the feeling it gives me, like something is waiting, something is watching. I've never been able to shake that feeling. Even now, at 23 years old, I won't go up there alone. The house isn't massive, but it's old. 2 floors, creaky wooden boards, the smell of dust and time settling into every corner. My grandparents sleep in separate bedrooms now, both on the first floor. When I was younger, I used to sleep upstairs, but once they moved downstairs, they put me in a different room on the first floor. That's when the footsteps started. I was 14 the first time I heard them. It was late. The house was dark. I was lying on the bed in my new room, trying to fall asleep. The quiet of the house settled in around me, the kind of quiet where every little noise, every shifting pipe, every groan of wood feels too loud. Then I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, steady footsteps coming from upstairs. My body tensed. The sound started at one end of the room above me and moved across, passing right over where I lay. The weight of each step pressed into the ceiling, deliberate and unhurried. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It did, right above the far end of my room. I stared at the ceiling, frozen. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't the house settling. It was the sound of someone walking. I knew, without a doubt, that no one was supposed to be up there. My grandparents were asleep in their separate rooms, both on the first floor. There was no reason for anyone to be upstairs. The air in the room felt heavier. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things, but then it started again. Thump, thump, thump. This time, the steps started at the far end of the room above me, where they had stopped before. They moved toward me again, slow and steady, and I could almost picture it, something unseen pacing back and forth. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My skin prickled with cold sweat. Then the footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard something else, a sound I never should have heard. The stairs. One step, two, three. Each creak was distinct, as if something was coming down. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. 4, 5. The footsteps reached the landing. Silence. I prayed that was it, that it was over. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The steps reached the first floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shake the bed. I couldn't see anything from where I lay, but I knew, I felt, that something was there. And then I heard the scratching. Slow, deliberate. A dragging sound against wood. I knew exactly where it was coming from. My grandpa's gun case. The scratches ran down the front of it, long and slow. I could hear the slight tap of the door moving in its frame with each scratch. I don't know how long it went on, seconds, minutes, hours. It felt like forever. I wanted to scream. I forced myself to take a deep breath and push the air out of my lungs as hard as I could. It came out as a choked, broken cry. But it was enough. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, fast and heavy. My grandpa. The moment he burst through the door, the sound stopped. The room was empty. Nothing was there. I tried to tell him what I heard, but he shook his head and said the house was old, that old wood creaks at night. He turned on the dining room light, told me to go back to sleep. I didn't. Instead, I climbed off the bed, draped a sheet over the side, and crawled underneath. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put in headphones, and faced the wall. If something was in the room, I didn't want to know. The next morning, my grandma shrugged off my fear. "Oh, that's silly," she said, like it was nothing. "Your cousin said the same thing last time she stayed here. Woke me up in the middle of the night. Said she heard footsteps. That was all. Just a casual remark. Like it was normal. I slept under the bed for the rest of the week. That was almost 10 years ago. I've stayed at my grandparents' house more times than I can count since then. And every single time, I hear the footsteps. They always start upstairs. Always the same slow, steady pace. Moving across the room above me. Stopping. Starting again. I don't sleep under the bed anymore. I sleep on top of it now, but I never face the door. I always keep my back to it. I sleep with headphones in, music turned up just enough to drown out the sound. And I've never heard it come down the stairs again. Not since that first night. But if it ever does, I don't want to know. Growing up, my sister, Emma, had an imaginary friend. Every kid has one at some point, so we didn't think much of it. She called her E, which always sounded weird to me. The name didn't make sense. It wasn't a real name, just 2 letters. But Emma was little, maybe 3 or 4, and when little kids talk about things like that, you just nod along and let them have their fun. Emma talked to E all the time. She'd sit in our room and have long conversations with nothing but empty air. Sometimes she'd laugh. Sometimes she'd just sit quietly listening. My parents figured it was normal. Even I thought it was normal, until one day, it just stopped. It was like she outgrew it overnight. No more conversations, no more laughs, no more talking about E. She just stopped mentioning her. If you asked, she'd get weird about it, shrug it off, change the subject. Whatever E had been, she wasn't anymore. I didn't think about E again for years. Emma was 10, and I was 13 when it happened. Mom got a phone call late in the evening. Grandpa wasn't doing well, and she needed to go to the nursing home right away. She and Dad left in a hurry. Emma and I were alone in the house. Our house wasn't huge, but it was old, the kind of place where the floors creaked even when no one was walking. It had been in our family for a long time. Mom had grown up there, and before that, it had belonged to her parents. I was on one end of the house, watching TV. Emma was in our shared room, doing whatever. It was just a normal night. Then the radio turned on. At first, I thought Emma was playing with it. The music blasted through the house, way too loud, loud enough to shake the walls. Then it shut off. A few seconds later, it turned on again, full volume. Then off, on, off. The pattern kept going, over and over. Loud, then silent. I could feel it in my chest, like something pressing against me every time the music blared to life. I got up, stormed down the hall, ready to tell Emma to cut it out. When I walked into our room, she was sitting on the bed, completely still. She wasn't laughing or messing around. Her face was white, like she had just seen something she wasn't supposed to. I turned to the radio, already reaching for the plug, except there was no plug. It wasn't plugged into the wall. I froze. I looked closer. No batteries. We didn't even have another radio in the house. I turned back to Emma, my mouth dry. She didn't say a word, just sat there, pale and frozen. I could see her hands gripping the blanket, knuckles white. I didn't know what to say. I reached out and shut the radio off myself, pressing the power button, even though I knew it shouldn't have been on to begin with. The second my finger touched it, the music cut out for good. Emma finally looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with something I didn't understand at the time. She whispered, almost too quiet to hear. It was E. That was the moment my skin crawled. I backed out of the room, grabbed the cordless phone, and called Mom. I didn't even care if she got mad. She answered on the first ring. I told her about the radio, about Emma, about how scared she looked. I expected her to tell me to knock it off, that it was just my imagination. But she didn't. She was crying. Grandpa just passed, she choked out. I don't remember the rest of the conversation. I think I hung up without saying anything. I turned to Emma, but she was still staring at the radio, not moving. That night, neither of us slept. A few days later, we went to the funeral. The church smelled like old wood and flowers, and everything felt heavy. People came up to us, saying things like, "I'm so sorry," and "he was a great man." I just nodded along. I wasn't sure how I felt. Grandpa had been sick for a long time, so his passing wasn't a surprise, but something about the timing, about the radio, about what Emma said, sat in my stomach like a weight. After the service, we gathered at the family home, where distant relatives we barely knew talked, and caught up like it was a reunion instead of a funeral. I wanted to go home, but Mom was too busy talking to leave. Then one of our relatives, a woman I barely recognized, came up to us. She had an old photograph in her hands. "I found this while going through some things," she said, handing it to my mom. "Thought you'd like to have it." It was a picture of my grandparents on their wedding day. I leaned in to look. Emma grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. I turned to her, ready to tell her to let go, but her face was the same as that night in our room. Pale, frozen. She pointed at the picture. "That's E." The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I looked again at the picture, at the smiling woman in the white dress. Our grandmother. She had died when my mom was just a kid. I had never seen a picture of her before. None of us had. My step-grandmother had gotten rid of all of them when she moved into the house, and no one ever talked about her. But Emma recognized her instantly. I felt sick. Mom's face crumpled. She stared at the picture for a long time, her hands shaking. No one said anything. Things weren't the same after that. Emma never talked about E again. If you asked, she'd shake her head, change the subject. She stopped playing in our room as much. She never turned the radio on again, even though I eventually plugged it back in. The house felt different too. Not haunted, not creepy, just different. Quieter maybe, like something had left. I never really figured out what happened. Maybe E had just been a kid's imagination. Maybe she had been something more. I don't know, but I do know one thing. Emma had never seen that picture before. None of us had. And yet, she had known exactly who she was. It was a few years ago when it happened. I don't remember the exact date, but I know it was summer because the heat had been unbearable that week. I had gone out for a walk, something I did often when I wanted to clear my head. I liked the woods, being away from people, away from the noise, just surrounded by trees and silence. This wasn't a proper trail, just a narrow path that had been made by deer or other animals cutting through the undergrowth over time. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but I had wandered further than usual. I liked to go off the beaten path, see things no one else had seen. That day, though, I found something I never should have. It started with the smell. It hit me all at once, a thick, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. At first, I thought maybe it was a dead deer. I'd come across animal carcasses before, especially in summer when the heat made them rot fast. But this was different. This was stronger. Worse, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the path, pushing through the undergrowth, my hands brushing against rough branches and leaves. The smell got stronger. I covered my nose with my shirt, but it didn't help. It clung to the air, to my skin. Then I saw him. He was lying there, half hidden by the ferns, his body bloated and discolored. His skin had turned shades of green and black, stretched tight over swollen limbs. His face, what was left of it, was barely recognizable. His eyes were gone, just dark, empty sockets staring up at the sky. In places, his flesh had been eaten away, the work of insects and scavengers. I froze. For a second, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. It didn't feel real. It was like my brain was trying to convince me that it was just a trick of the light, that if I blinked, he would disappear. But he didn't. He was still there, rotting in the dirt. I don't know how long I stood there before I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I dialed 911, my voice unsteady as I told them what I had found. The dispatcher asked me to stay there until the police arrived. I wanted to argue, to tell them I couldn't, but my mouth was dry, my tongue heavy. I just said okay, and hung up. Then I waited. The woods, which had felt peaceful before, now felt suffocating. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig made my heart pound. I kept looking at him, then looking away, then looking back. The worst part was the silence. I thought the forest would be loud with insects and birds, but everything was quiet, like even nature didn't want to be near him. It got dark before they arrived. I hadn't realized how long I'd been sitting there until the light started to fade. The shadows stretched out, swallowing the trees. My phone's battery was low, and I was too afraid to use the flashlight, too afraid to see him in the dim light, his body shifting in the shadows. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. I kept expecting him to move. I knew he wouldn't. He was long dead, but my mind played tricks on me. I imagined his fingers twitching, his head turning, those empty sockets fixing on me. When the police finally arrived, I barely heard them at first. It wasn't until I saw the beams of their flashlights cutting through the trees that I realized how stiff I had become. My muscles locked in place from sitting there for so long. They asked me questions. My answers were short. No, I didn't know him. No, I hadn't touched anything. No, I hadn't seen anyone else around. They nodded, took notes, and told me I could go. I almost ran back to the main trail. My legs felt unsteady, like I'd been sitting in one position for too long, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I saw the flashing lights of their vehicles through the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His swollen face, his empty eyes. I dreamed I was back in the woods, but this time, I couldn't leave. The trees pressed in, trapping me there with him. It didn't stop. For weeks after, I dreamed of him. At first, it was just images, his body, the way it had looked in the fading light. But then, the dreams changed. I was back in the woods, standing over him, but this time he wasn't just lying there. He was looking at me. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, one night, I heard it. You shouldn't have found me. I woke up shaking, my heart racing so fast I thought I might be having a heart attack. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, just my mind processing what had happened. But the dreams kept coming. Some nights, he was closer. Some nights, I was the one lying on the ground, looking up at him. I stopped going into the woods after that. The thought of being out there alone, surrounded by trees, made my skin crawl. Even walking near the edge of the forest made my stomach twist. It took months before I could sleep without waking up drenched in sweat. The dreams didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent. I started to believe I was moving on, that I was forgetting. Then one night, I woke up and saw him. Not in a dream. Not in my mind. I was lying in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. My heart was racing before I even knew why. Then I saw the shape in the corner of the room. A shadow darker than the rest, something that shouldn't have been there. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I don't know if it was real or just my imagination. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after everything that happened. That's what I tell myself. That's what I have to believe. But sometimes, even now, years later, I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, my skin cold with sweat. And I swear, for just a second, I can still smell that sickly sweet rot hanging in the air. I was 10 years old when it happened. 10 years have passed, and I still don't have an answer. None of us do. We've all grown up, moved on with our lives in different ways. But whenever we get together, someone always brings it up. Because how could we not? It wasn't just something we imagined, it was real. We all saw it. We all felt it. And yet somehow it never happened. That night, the house was full of us. My siblings and my cousins. There were about 10 of us in total, all kids, packed into the living room. The adults had gone out for dinner, some kind of get-together for the parents and grandparents, so we had the house to ourselves. Not that it meant much. We weren't doing anything crazy, just watching movies, eating snacks, sprawled out on the couches and floor. I remember the glow of the TV screen, the way the room felt warm and full of energy, the occasional arguments over which movie to put on next. It was one of those nights where you felt safe, even with the house so empty. We had each other. The house was locked. Everything was fine. Until it wasn't. The moment it happened is burned into my brain. 1 second, we were just sitting there, completely caught up in whatever was on the screen. The next, the entire house shook. Not like a little rumble. Not like when a truck drives by, or when thunder rolls in the distance. This was violent. It was like something hit the house, something massive. A deep, thunderous boom filled the air, and for a split second, I thought the walls were going to come down around us. At the exact same moment, there was a flash outside. A bright, white light, cutting through the windows, spilling into the room. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Enough to send my heart racing. Enough to make my stomach drop like I'd just stepped off a cliff. And then silence. For half a second, no one moved. No one spoke. The movie was still playing, but I couldn't hear it anymore over the ringing in my ears. Then, all at once, we reacted the way kids do when something really bad happens. We ran. As a pack, like animals sensing a predator, we bolted from the living room, sprinting down the hallway to the safest place we could think of, where the rooms were, where the walls felt thicker, where we could huddle together. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, feel it in my fingertips. My breath came in fast, sharp gasps. I remember standing there in the dark hallway, pressed against my cousins and siblings, all of us shaking, wide-eyed, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 10. It felt like forever. No more shaking. No more noise. Just us, breathing hard, listening to every single creak of the house like it might mean something. Finally, the older kids started whispering to each other. Should we call the police? That was the first thought, the obvious one. Something had happened. Something big. But what if it wasn't that serious? What if the parents got mad? What if they didn't believe us? So instead, they called the parents. I don't remember the exact words exchanged, just that the call was fast, hushed, urgent. And then we waited. After a while, the fear turned into something else. Curiosity. We weren't dead. The house hadn't collapsed. Whatever happened, it was over. Slowly, we worked up the courage to move again, to step out of the hallway. But we weren't stupid. We grabbed whatever we could as weapons. A baseball bat, a kitchen knife, a broken curtain rod, a fireplace poker. Not that we knew what we were defending ourselves against. The living room looked exactly the same as we had left it, except now the TV's glow felt harsher, unnatural. The windows stared back at us, black and empty. Nothing was moving. There was no sound outside. One of the older cousins took a deep breath and made the call. We have to check the backyard. No one wanted to, but we had to. The door leading outside was locked. That was a small relief. It meant whatever had happened hadn't come inside. The eldest cousin unlocked it, and we all stood there for a second, frozen, before stepping out onto the deck. It was cold. The air had that strange, still feeling it gets after a storm, but the sky was clear. Stars, moon, no clouds, no rain, and nothing else. No crater, no fallen tree, no scorch marks, no broken glass, no sign that anything had happened at all. But it had. We stood there for a long time, scanning the yard, the trees, the fence line, listening, waiting for something, anything to make sense. Nothing did. Eventually, we went back inside, sat together in the living room, not watching the movie, just listening to every creak and groan of the house. Every passing car made us jump. Every gust of wind sent chills down our spines. A half hour passed. Then the parents came home. We told them everything, voices overlapping, trying to explain what we had seen, what we had felt, the shaking, the boom, the flash of light. But they didn't believe us. They stepped outside, checked the backyard. Nothing was wrong. No neighbors heard anything. No security lights had gone off. No news reports about an explosion. No signs of a power surge. No missing time. No logical explanation. Just nothing. That was 10 years ago. We still talk about it, still go over every detail, trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Maybe it was some kind of electrical phenomenon, some freak accident, some natural event we don't understand. Maybe there's an explanation out there that we just haven't found. But that night, we all felt it. We all saw it. And yet somehow it never happened. When I was 12, I lived with my dad in a neighborhood that never quite felt like home. I had moved in with him 2 years earlier, leaving behind everything familiar. My old friends, my school, even the streets I knew by heart gone. My dad had his own life, his own habits, and I was just learning to fit into them. I didn't know anyone at first, but he had friends in the area, and through them, I met the only kids around my age. There was a single mom with 3 kids who my dad's friends knew well. She worked hard, always gone for long shifts, leaving her kids to fend for themselves most of the time. Her oldest daughter was 2 years older than me. She was 12 when we first met, and though we weren't close, we ended up in the same circle. It was one of those friendships that happen by default. You don't pick each other, you're just around each other enough that it becomes normal. Her name, I'll keep it to myself. The way things ended, I can't bring myself to say it too easily. Even now, decades later, it feels wrong to write it down. That night, I wasn't there. That's something I think about all the time. If I had been, would things have been different? Would it have been worse? These are the kinds of questions that creep up in the early hours when the rest of the world is asleep, when my mind turns to places I'd rather not go. It was a week before Christmas. A cold, gray evening. The kind of night where the streetlights come on early, stretching long shadows across the pavement. My friend's mother was at work, like always, and the kids were alone in the house. Rob, one of the guys in our friend group, was hanging out with them. He wasn't supposed to be there. The mom had rules about boys in the house when she wasn't home, but rules don't mean much when you're a teenager. Then came the knock. My friend heard it and, without thinking, opened the door. There was a certain rhythm to the way her mother knocked, a pattern she recognized, and that's what she must have thought it was. It wasn't. Rob, knowing he wasn't supposed to be there, reacted first. He slipped out the window and ran home without looking back. Later, he'd say he never thought twice about it. He just ran. What happened inside that house after he left, I only know the edges of it. The facts. The things that made it into the news. The things whispered about in hushed voices. I never wanted to know the details, and I still don't. But I know enough. The woman at the door had no business being there. She wasn't some random stranger. She was the sister of a woman my friend's mother had been helping. The mother worked with troubled people, trying to get them on their feet, and through her job, she had come across this woman's sister. This woman had just been released from a mental institution. I don't know what was wrong with her. People said different things. Some said she was violent. Some said she wasn't supposed to be out yet, that she'd slipped through cracks in the system. That part doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that she found out where my friend's family lived. She found out that the mother worked nights. She knew exactly when to come. The younger brother, just a little kid, managed to escape. Somehow, he got away and made it to a neighbor's house. He called the police. But by the time they got there, it was too late. What they found inside the house, it broke something in our neighborhood. People liked to believe that kind of thing didn't happen there. That it couldn't. But it did. My friend was dead. Murdered. Not just killed, but brutalized in a way that was so horrific it made the news. Her body was in the bathtub, stripped bare. Her head was missing. They had to search for it. It wasn't in the tub. It wasn't in the room. The police looked everywhere, and eventually they found it. Among the Christmas presents. I don't know who made that discovery. I don't want to know what that moment was like. I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. Maybe my dad thought it would be too much for me. Maybe he was right. At 12, you don't have the words for grief like that. You don't know what to do with it, where to put it. All I knew was that she was gone, and the way she was gone was something I couldn't understand. For a long time, I tried not to think about it, but you can't push something like that away forever. Sometimes, when I hear a knock at the door, I still flinch. Sometimes, when I see Christmas presents wrapped up under a tree, I think about what the police found that night. I wonder if my friend was scared. I wonder if she had time to realize what was happening. I wonder if she thought about calling out for help, or if she knew there was no one coming. I think about how easily it could have been me, and I think about how, in a way, it still was. A week after getting my CPR certification, I had to use it. I never thought I actually would, at least not so soon. The training was just something to have, a safety net in case I was ever in a situation where I could help. I figured if anything, it would be something minor. Maybe someone choking in a restaurant or an old person passing out at a family gathering. Not this. Not someone dying. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. I was at a thrift store with some friends, searching for costumes. The place smelled like old fabric and dust, a mix of mothballs and cheap air freshener. The lighting was dim, yellowish, the kind that made everything feel just a little off. It wasn't busy, just a few other people browsing, flipping through racks of secondhand clothes, handling old knickknacks. The kind of quiet place where the sound of a single hanger sliding across a metal bar could cut through the air. I was in the dressing room, trying on some oversized jacket that smelled like someone's basement, when everything just stopped. The chatter outside the room hushed all at once, like someone had pressed pause on the world. That kind of silence where you just know something is wrong. I pulled the curtain back. My friends were standing near the entrance, looking at each other, eyes wide. A woman had just come in, her voice shaking. Someone was passed out in the parking lot. I felt my chest tighten. I don't know why, but I stepped forward. "Call 911, I said. "I'm CPR certified. I'll check." The words came out automatically, like my brain was running on autopilot. I pushed open the door and stepped into the cool night air. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by flickering yellow streetlights. At first, I didn't see anything, just rows of parked cars, silent and still. Then someone pointed, way out, near the far end of the lot, where a single car sat by itself. "Over there." I ran. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The air felt too cold, too sharp. I didn't know what I was about to see, but nothing could have prepared me for it. She was slumped against the window, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was blue. Not pale, not sickly. Blue. A deep, lifeless shade that told me everything before I even reached the car. She wasn't breathing. Her eyes were half open. I froze for half a second, my stomach twisting. Then I forced myself to move. Someone else was there now, a man, maybe in his 40s, looking just as panicked as I felt. We yanked the door open. Needles, pill bottles, scattered across the floor like trash. Her body slumped sideways as the door swung open. I reached for her wrist, my fingers pressing against ice-cold skin. No pulse. I checked her neck. Nothing. Tears streaked her cheeks. I don't know why, but that broke something in me. She hadn't died peacefully. She had died knowing it was happening. I barely had time to process it before we pulled her out of the car and onto the cold pavement. Someone checked for a pulse again, just to be sure. Still nothing. I tilted her head back, checked her airway. No obstructions. Just emptiness. I pressed my hands to her chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her ribs pushed back under my hands. She felt so small, so fragile. 5, 6, 7. The thrift store door swung open. People were watching. A woman had her hands over her mouth. My friend stood frozen near the entrance. 15 compressions. I tilted her head back and pinched her nose shut. One breath. Her chest barely moved. Another breath. Nothing. I went back to compressions. My arms were already burning, but I didn't stop. She was too young for this. Late 20s, maybe. She had tattoos, 2 names inked on her skin. A car seat sat in the back of her car. A few toys on the floor. She had kids. The ambulance sirens cut through the night. I didn't stop. Even when the paramedics rushed toward us, I kept going until hands pulled me back. My legs felt unsteady as I stumbled away, letting them take over. They worked fast. Another round of CPR, an injection, Narcan, I realized. The drug that could reverse an overdose. But it had to be given in time. And I knew, even as I stood there watching, that it had already been too long. Another ambulance pulled up. More EMTs. A cop. They surrounded her, moving with urgency, voices blending together. She's been down too long. Keep going until we get to the hospital. They lifted her onto a stretcher. Someone climbed into the back of the ambulance, continuing CPR even as the doors swung shut. The sirens wailed again, and then they were gone. I stood there, hands shaking, my breath fogging in the cold air. The cop turned to us, his face grim. They'll do what they can, but he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were white. My arms ached. My chest felt hollow. I had tried. I had done everything I was trained to do, and it hadn't been enough. The thrift store parking lot was still again. The people watching from the door started to drift back inside, murmuring to each other. My friends walked up, quiet, unsure what to say. "Are you okay?" someone finally asked. I didn't know how to answer. I looked back at the empty space where the ambulance had been, where she had been. The needles were still there, scattered on the pavement. The pill bottles. The car seat. The car seat. I turned away. The cold air bit at my skin. I knew I'd never forget this. The blue face. The tears. The way her body had felt under my hands, so still, so unmoving. The hopelessness of it. A week ago, I had gotten CPR certified, thinking I might be able to help someone someday. Tonight, I had tried, and it wasn't enough. My uncle used to work a lot when I was younger. He's done all sorts of jobs to make money, but one thing he's always done consistently is paint houses. Every summer, and well into fall, he'd be out there working. It was a legitimate business. He had a truck with his company name and phone number on the side, all the supplies in the back, everything you'd expect. Sometimes, when he needed an extra hand, he'd call my dad, and every now and then, that meant I'd end up working for him too. It wasn't a big deal. Painting houses isn't exactly thrilling, but it's not hard work either, and it paid well. There was one year, though, that still haunts me. A job I'll never forget. That fall had been unusually wet. It seemed like it rained every other day, and the weather constantly delayed work. My uncle always juggled multiple jobs at once, so when the rain slowed everything down, he started falling behind. As a result, I ended up working for him more than usual. I didn't mind. I was 17 at the time, and extra cash was always nice. One afternoon, my uncle got a call from a woman about a house we'd been working on. It was a big Victorian place in a quiet part of town. She and her husband lived there, and he was an author, some novelist, though I'd never heard of him. The rain had already delayed the job, and there were apparently some family issues going on too, which complicated things even more. Now, the woman was asking if we could finish up as soon as possible because her husband was trying to work, but the scaffolding outside his study was distracting him. My uncle always prided himself on being an honest businessman. The job had been contracted in midsummer, and he'd had every intention of finishing it on time, but the weather had other plans. He didn't want to lose a customer or get a bad recommendation, so he decided we'd make it a priority. After all, it was nearly done, just a day or two of work left. We showed up in the mid-afternoon. It was a weird kind of chilly that day. Not freezing, but a damp, creeping cold that settled in your bones. The sky was heavy and gray, overcast but not quite threatening rain. Everything felt still. No wind, no movement. Just a strange, eerie calm. The kind of day that belongs in the opening scene of a crime novel. The house itself was beautiful, in that old, slightly decayed way that Victorian houses tend to be. Tall, narrow, with steep gables and intricate woodwork along the eaves. The front was already finished, so we went straight to the back. That's where the real work was left. My uncle, being the more experienced painter, handled the touch-ups. My job was to put on the first coats, which didn't require much skill. As we set up, He asked me if I was scared of heights. I wasn't exactly comfortable with them, but I didn't want to seem like a kid in front of him, so I said no. That was good enough for him. He told me to climb the scaffolding to the 3rd floor and finish a section near a small, oval-shaped attic window. That window, he told me, looked into the husband's study, the place where he did most of his writing. I climbed up, cans of paint dangling from my belt, brushes and tools strapped in. When I reached the top, I set everything down, opened a can, and got to work. At first, it was just another job. The cold made my fingers stiff, but I kept painting. Dipped the brush, spread the paint, moved to the next section. Over and over. The repetition made it easy to get lost in my own thoughts. The stillness of the day didn't help. No birds, no wind. Just silence. Then, I got to the window. I bent down to dip my brush again, and when I stood back up, my eyes naturally flicked toward the glass. That's when I saw him. A man, sitting inside the attic, staring directly at me. His face was empty. Not just blank, completely devoid of anything. No anger, no sadness, no frustration. Just nothing. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone to be there. Maybe that's why it startled me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, I just stood there, staring back at him. Then, trying to shake off the weird feeling, I gave him a small, nervous chuckle and a polite nod. He didn't react, didn't blink, didn't move. And then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted a gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. The window glass cracked from the force of the shot. His head snapped to the side as blood and bits of skull painted the wall behind him. I gasped. A short, choked noise. Then I took a step back. A step too far. The scaffold beneath me disappeared, and for a split second I was weightless. Then pain. Sudden, jarring impact. The world spun, and I realized I had fallen. I hit something hard, branches, leaves, dirt. My body crumpled into a bush below. Pain shot through my ankle like fire. My head throbbed. My hands were shaking. I heard my uncle yelling my name. Then, heavy footsteps running toward me. Everything felt distant. My vision blurred, my ears rang. But one thing was clear. I could still see him. In my mind. That face. That emptiness. That moment before the shot. My uncle was next to me, checking if I was okay. I couldn't even answer him. My body was there, but my mind was still up on that scaffold, still locked in that moment. I don't remember much after that. The ambulance came. The police. I was in shock. They told me later that I had a broken ankle, some bruised ribs, a mild concussion. But the worst injuries were in my head. I had to go to counseling for a while. I didn't talk much about what I saw, not at first. People don't really understand unless they've been through something like that. I couldn't shake that image. The way he looked at me, the way he pulled the trigger without hesitation, like it was just another task on his list, like he didn't care. I found out later he had been struggling. Depression, marriage problems, drinking, writer's block. Maybe it all piled up until he just couldn't take it anymore. Maybe he had planned to do it anyway, and I just happened to be there. His wife moved out soon after. The house was put up for sale, but no one ever bought it. It still stands, abandoned, falling into disrepair. I avoid that street now. If I ever drive by, I keep my eyes on the road, because I know deep down that if I look up at that attic window, I'll see him there, staring, emotionless. I grew up in a bizarre little house. It was incredibly tall and thin, almost like an attached home, but completely freestanding. 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. It was an old thing, built in some decade that felt distant even to my parents, and it was full of odd quirks that never really made sense. There were 2 working fireplaces, even though only one was ever used. The basement had a single, lonely shower stall in the middle of the room, like some kind of afterthought. The backyard was barely big enough to turn around in, and the only way to get something from the kitchen to my bedroom was to send it up in an old-timey rope-pulled dumbwaiter. It was a strange place, and I loved it. It felt unique, like it had personality, like it had been designed with some wild, half-baked logic that only made sense if you lived there long enough. But old houses have old house problems, and by the time I was 12, my parents had finally had enough. The roof leaked, the pipes rattled, and the floor creaked in ways that weren't charming anymore. The cost of fixing it all was too high, and they made the decision to move. Packing was a nightmare. My room was an explosion of half-folded clothes, toys I hadn't played with in years, and things I had shoved into corners just to get them out of sight. I started throwing things down the dumbwaiter to save myself trips down the stairs, watching as my stuff disappeared into that little dark chute and hoping nothing got stuck on the way. The closet was the worst. I had packed it so full over the years that the clothes had practically become a single, solid brick. When I started pulling everything out, I uncovered something I had never noticed before, an attic entrance in the ceiling. It was a small, square panel, one of those drop-down ones that didn't even have a pull cord. I hadn't seen it before because it had been completely hidden by my mess. If we hadn't been moving, I might never have found it at all. I was an adventurous kid. I liked finding hidden things, and this was the ultimate hidden thing, an entire part of the house I had never explored. My parents were downstairs, arguing over what furniture to take, so I figured I had time. I stood on the brick of clothes, pushed up on the panel, and climbed through. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as I expected. Old, red Christmas lights were strung across the beams, glowing faintly. The bulbs were dusty, coated in cobwebs, but they still held a weak, dying incandescence, as if someone had plugged them in once a long time ago and just never unplugged them. The second thing I noticed was that this space wasn't just an empty, forgotten attic. It was lived in. The insulation had been covered with plastic sheets. There was a gurney pushed against one wall, piled with sleeping bags and old sheets, like some kind of makeshift bed. A mint green refrigerator stood in the corner, one of those old ones with the heavy latch handle. I stepped toward it, pulled it open, and to my shock, it still hummed. The light flickered on inside. There was nothing in it except a single glass bottle. And then I saw the bones. They were everywhere. Piles of them, heaped together in clusters, all different shapes and sizes. Some were small, almost delicate. Others were large, long, and thick. None of them looked fresh. They were all bleached white, dry, stripped clean. Two of the piles were different. They were blackened, charred. Someone had tried to burn them. The wall nearest to those piles was smeared with something dark, something ashy. And in those smears, one word appeared again and again. Sorry. I stared at it. My brain felt slow, like it was trying to catch up to what I was seeing. I didn't know much about bones. I was 12, but I knew enough to know that these weren't all animal bones. I stepped backward. My foot hit something. I looked down and saw a small, handheld saw lying on the floor. The blade was dark, stained. I turned and scrambled back through the attic entrance, dropping down into my closet so fast that I twisted my ankle. I didn't care. I shoved the clothes back over the hole, grabbed my half-packed backpack, and ran down the stairs. My parents were still arguing. My mom turned when she saw me. "What happened?" she asked. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to scream about what I had seen. But I was a kid, and somehow in that moment, my brain told me one thing. Don't say anything. I don't know why I stayed quiet. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something deeper, something instinctual. But I didn't say a word. We moved out a week later. The house was sold to a contractor who planned to gut it. I never told my parents. I never told anyone. But sometimes late at night, I think about that attic. And I wonder, who lived up there? How long had they been there? Had they been there the whole time? And most of all, what were they sorry for? I was 17, fresh out of high school, and just starting my first semester of college in the big city. I'd lived my entire life in a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, where doors were rarely locked, and where the worst thing that ever happened was the occasional fight at the local diner. Coming to the city was overwhelming in ways I hadn't expected. The noise never stopped, the streets were always crowded, and people moved fast, physically and mentally. I was out of my element, but I was too stubborn to admit it. That stubbornness was exactly what got me into trouble that night. It was late, later than I had ever been out by myself before. My friends and I had been hanging out at someone's apartment off campus, and before I knew it, the night had stretched into early morning. By the time I decided to leave, it was nearly 1:30 a.m. I had a dorm room a few miles away, and I was sure I knew the way back. It didn't seem worth the hassle of calling a cab or waking someone up to come get me. After all, I was in a city. People walked everywhere, right? I had no idea where I was. The first few blocks felt fine. The streets were empty, but that wasn't surprising. It was late after all. But as I kept walking, the the scenery changed. The nice apartments gave way to boarded-up buildings. Storefronts were covered in graffiti. The streetlights became less frequent, and the ones that did exist flickered or were completely busted out. The pavement was cracked, trash piled up against the curbs. I was too deep in my own head, focusing on my internal map, to realize how wrong everything looked. Then I heard shouting. Not the usual city noise. This was different. Angrier. I glanced toward a row of crumbling townhouses and saw two figures in the shadows, yelling at each other. I couldn't make out their words, but the tension in their voices made my stomach twist. I picked up my pace, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I noticed the car. It was creeping along behind me, just slow enough to match my pace. I hadn't even heard it pull up. It was an old sedan, its headlights dim, the engine barely making a sound. My pulse spiked as I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at it. 5 men, all of them staring right at me. I looked away immediately, my mind racing. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't noticed. Maybe they were just driving slowly for some other reason. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but they kept following me. For almost an entire block, the car stayed right beside me, never speeding up, never slowing down, just keeping pace. My skin prickled, and my breath started coming in shallow, quick bursts. I had never felt fear like this before. Not the nervous kind of fear you get before a test, or when you hear a strange noise outside your house. This was different. It was paralyzing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't outrun a car. I couldn't call for help. There was no one around. I was completely alone. Then they pulled ahead. The car eased forward, rolling toward the next intersection. For a split second, I felt relief. Maybe they were done messing with me. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting. Then they turned left and stopped, right in my path. My body locked up. I just stood there, staring at the car, my brain refusing to work. This was it. This was the moment where everything went wrong. I thought about running, but where? The streets were empty, and even if I tried, they could just cut me off again. I was completely at their mercy, and they knew it. I don't know how long I stood there. My hands were shaking. My legs felt weak. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then light. A porch light snapped on just beyond the car. A door opened. A man walked outside, holding a bag of trash. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't even look in my direction at first. He just strolled down his porch steps, completely unaware of the scene in front of him. The moment his feet hit the pavement, the car roared to life. Tires squealed. The sedan peeled away, disappearing into the darkness. I gasped, my legs giving out beneath me. My whole body started shaking as the adrenaline finally hit. My hands went to my face, and before I could stop myself, I started crying. Not just sniffling, full body, uncontrollable sobs. The man finally looked over and noticed me. I must have looked insane. A random girl standing in the middle of the street, crying and shaking like I'd just escaped from something awful. He didn't ask questions right away. He just walked over, slow and careful, like he was afraid of scaring me more. I don't remember exactly what I said. Probably something incoherent, broken up by gasps and sobs. I tried to explain, but my words were tumbling over each other, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He nodded, listened, then motioned for me to follow him inside. I hesitated for a second, strangers and all, but something in me just knew I could trust him. He didn't seem dangerous. If anything, he seemed like the only safe thing in the entire city at that moment. Inside, his roommate was still awake, sitting on a couch in a tiny living room cluttered with papers and notebooks. He looked up in surprise, but before he could ask, the first guy just said, "She needs a minute." They gave me a soda. I sat on their couch, my hands still trembling so bad I almost dropped the can. I don't remember how long I stayed there, just breathing, letting the fear drain out of me. They didn't push for details. They just let me exist in their space until I felt human again. Eventually, they walked me back to my dorm. It was late, so late that the streets were starting to shift again, no longer completely deserted, but not yet filled with the early morning crowd. We didn't talk much on the way. I was still too shaken up to process what had almost happened. What could have happened? When we got to my building, they said I should check out their stand-up sometime. That's when I realized they were comedians. It almost made me laugh. The guys who had just saved me from something horrible spent their nights telling jokes to strangers in bars. I never saw them again, didn't even remember their names. But I know, without a doubt, that if that guy hadn't decided to take his trash out at 1 in the morning, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I was so lucky, and I never made that mistake again. I was never meant to be a hunter. I knew that from the start. I never had the stomach for it. The idea of taking a life for fun never sat right with me. It wasn't about ethics or some deep moral stance. I just didn't see the point in killing something just to say you had. My dad and the rest of my family, though they lived for it. Every year, when hunting season rolled around, they'd start getting that itch. They'd talk about the best spots, the biggest deer they'd seen last season, the gear they were going to bring. It was all they cared about, and because I was part of the family, they expected me to care too. That's how I ended up in the woods that day. I had no intention of shooting anything, and they knew it. But they didn't want to leave me at camp alone, either, so they came up with a compromise. They dropped me off at one of the ground blinds, set me up with a radio, and if I saw any deer moving in their direction, I could call it out. That way, I'd still be participating in the hunt without actually pulling the trigger. Fine by me. I brought my Game Boy along, figuring I could kill time grinding in Pokemon. It wasn't the worst setup in the world. The ground blind was just a small wooden box with a slatted opening in the front for sight lines, nothing fancy. It smelled like old wood and damp leaves. The floor was covered in bits of dried mud, probably from the last person who sat here. I settled in, wedged myself into the corner, and got to work leveling up my team. At first, it wasn't too bad. The woods had that quiet, muffled stillness that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant crack of a rifle, but for the most part, it was just me, the wind, and the occasional rustling of leaves. I played until my battery started to run low. I figured I'd switch games, so I reached into my backpack and started digging around. That's when I heard it, a strange whooshing sound, low and rhythmic, like something moving in the wind. I paused, listening. It sounded close, too close. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bird flapping its wings against the blind. I set my Game Boy down and slowly turned my head, scanning the trees outside the front opening. Nothing. The sound came again. A steady, shivering noise, like dry leaves being disturbed all at once. It was coming from behind me. I turned around, my stomach tightening, but the back wall was solid wood. There was nothing there. The sound didn't stop. I stood up, feeling uneasy. It wasn't just a noise, it was movement. Something was shifting, pressing against the outside of the blind. I crept toward the opening, heart hammering, and stepped outside. The forest was still, just as it had been before. The trees stood tall and indifferent, their bare branches stretching toward the sky. The wind had died down completely. I took a step toward the back of the blind. Then I saw it. The entire back wall of the blind was moving. A rippling, shifting mass covered every inch of it, a tangled, writhing sheet of long, spindly legs and bulbous bodies. Spiders. Hundreds, no thousands of them. Daddy long legs. They clung together in a dense, pulsing layer, so thick that I couldn't see the wood beneath them. They moved as one, a living, breathing mass of twitching legs and clustered bodies. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt thick and wrong, like it had turned solid in my lungs. I had never been afraid of spiders before that moment. I thought about running. I should have run, but I had no idea where I was. The blind was deep in the woods, miles from camp, and I didn't know the way back. If I took off, I could end up even more lost. Instead, I did something much stupider. I had a can of off in my backpack, and I had a lighter. In my panic, my brain latched onto the simplest, most immediate solution: fire. I fumbled in my bag, my fingers shaking as I pulled out the can and the lighter. I didn't think. I just acted. I flicked the lighter open, pressed the nozzle on the off can, and ignited the spray. A jet of flame shot forward, hitting the massive spider's dead center. For a fraction of a second, it worked. The fire licked across them, blackening legs and bodies in an instant. The movement stopped. The sound stopped. And then everything went wrong. The second the flames touched them, they let go. The entire wall of spiders detached from the blind all at once, and because I was standing downwind, they came straight at me. A tidal wave of burning, flying spiders. I don't remember screaming, but I know I did. I felt them hit me, crawling, sticking, burning. I slapped at them, staggered backward, and tripped. I hit the ground hard, rolling over and over, trying to get them off. My clothes caught some of the fire, and I tore them off without thinking. My arms, my neck, my face. I felt them everywhere. I grabbed the radio with shaking hands, barely able to think, and screamed for my dad to come get me. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. When they found me, I was still on the ground, covered in dirt, my clothes scattered around me. I don't remember much about the ride back. My dad asked what happened, but I couldn't talk. I just sat there shaking. I don't even remember getting back to camp. I just remember suddenly being home, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling them on me even though they weren't there. I never went hunting again. I went through therapy after that. I told myself it was just an accident, a stupid mistake, that I'd overreacted. But the truth is, that moment, those seconds when the spiders let go, when they came flying at me, it changed something in me. I can't be around them anymore. I don't care if people say daddy longlegs aren't real spiders, that they're harmless. It doesn't matter. The way they move, the way they cluster together, I can't take it. Even now, years later, when I see a spider, my body reacts before my brain does. My pulse spikes. My hands shake. I get the overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible, because I'll never forget what it felt like. The weight of them, the heat of the fire, the sound of thousands of tiny legs letting go. I grew up in an old Victorian house, the kind that creaked and groaned even when no one was moving. It had high ceilings, narrow hallways, and doors that never quite fit their frames. The walls held onto heat in the summer and let in the cold in the winter, and no matter how much my mother cleaned, there was always dust settling back into the corners. The house smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, like the past was trapped inside it. I was an only child, just 5 or 6 years old when it started. My mother was a single parent, working late shifts to keep us afloat, and that meant I spent a lot of time alone. She did her best to make the house feel warm and safe, but there was something about it that always felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. Just a feeling, a sense that the house was too quiet when I was alone, but too loud when I was trying to sleep. At night, the silence never lasted long. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me, and then I would hear it, laughter. Not from the street, not from a neighbor's house, but close. Inside. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but once I focused on it, I couldn't unhear it. It was the sound of children giggling, somewhere just beyond my bedroom door. I remember lying there, frozen under my blankets, listening. It would start off light, playful, like the kind of laughter you hear on a playground. But then it would change, becoming hushed, like whispering laughter, like someone was trying not to be heard. That made it worse. It felt deliberate, intentional. At first, I thought it had to be the TV. My mother often left it on when she fell asleep, and sound carried strangely through the house. But when I got up to check, creeping into the hallway with my bare feet cold against the floor, I saw that the TV was off. The house was dark except for the streetlight glow leaking through the curtains. But the laughter, it hadn't stopped. I went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, telling myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe I was just hearing things. But then it happened again, night after night. The same laughter, the same hushed giggles just outside my room. When I finally mentioned it to my mother, she barely looked up from the sink where she was washing dishes. "It's probably just the TV," she said, scrubbing at a plate. I must have left it on too late. That answer should have comforted me, but it didn't. The way she said it, so quick, so dismissive, it felt like she didn't want to talk about it, like she was trying to end the conversation before it even started. So, I stopped bringing it up. I told myself she was right, that it was the TV or the pipes or something else entirely, something normal. I wanted to believe that, until the night it got worse. I woke up to the sound of laughter again, but this time it wasn't in the hallway. It was in my room. The second I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier, like the room was pressing down on me. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't. Something was holding me down. I could feel it, 2 hands pressing firmly against my shoulders. Not just a weight, but fingers. Fingers gripping me, pinning me to the mattress. I tried to move, tried to scream, but my breath caught in my throat. My whole body tensed, my heartbeat slamming in my ears. The laughter was right next to me. It wasn't soft anymore. It was louder, clearer, as if someone was right there, inches away, giggling like it was all a game. Panic took over. I opened my mouth and finally found my voice, letting out a scream so loud that my chest hurt. I thrashed against the invisible grip, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. My mother burst into the room, flicking on the bedside lamp. The second the light filled the room, the weight on my shoulders was gone. The laughter was gone. I sat up, gasping, my whole body shaking. She rushed to my side, telling me it was just a dream, that I must have imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. My shoulders still ached where the hands had been. And when I told her that, when I said, "But my shoulders hurt," her face changed. She pulled up my shirt, and the second she saw my skin, her breath caught. I didn't understand why, not at first. But then she turned me toward the mirror, and I saw them. 2 handprints, clear as day, large, adult-sized. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. My mother's hands shook as she reached out, touching the marks like she could wipe them away, but they didn't fade. Neither of us knew what to say. After that night, my mother stopped brushing it off. She never mentioned the TV again. She started checking on me more, leaving the hallway light on even though she used to say it was a waste of electricity. But we never talked about it. Not really. The handprints faded, but the feeling never did. The laughter stopped for a while, or maybe I just learned to ignore it. I grew up, moved out, put it behind me, or I thought I had. Then, years later, in a casual conversation, I mentioned it to my mother. Just a passing comment, something like, "Hey, do you remember when I used to hear laughter in that old house?" I expected her to laugh it off, to say I had an overactive imagination. But she didn't. Instead, she went pale. She looked at me like I had said something awful, something she didn't want to remember. Her mouth opened, then closed again, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she just shook her head. "I don't want to remember that," she said. And that was the end of it. I didn't push. I didn't ask her what she meant, because deep down I already knew. Some things aren't meant to be remembered. Some things don't fade, no matter how much you try to forget them. And some things, no matter how much you tell yourself otherwise, were never just dreams. I was 17 when I got my license, and freedom had never tasted so good. My friends and I had a thing for abandoned places. Something about the thrill of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be, the eerie silence of a house left to rot, the mystery of why it had been abandoned in the first place. We'd made it a mission to find places like that, especially ones where we could throw parties. We had found a few good spots over the years, but there was one that had caught my attention more than any other. I would pass it every night on my way home from work. It was a massive house, or at least it was supposed to be. From the outside, it looked like the construction had just stopped. The walls were up, the structure was there, but there were no windows, no doors, just a dark, unfinished shell of a home. There was a large property behind it, stretching far back into the woods. The driveway was cracked, weeds creeping through like nature was trying to reclaim it. Every time I passed by, it gave me this weird feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be looking at it for too long. I told my friend Eric about it one night, before we were supposed to go see a movie. He was always down for this kind of thing, and it didn't take much convincing before he said, "Let's go check it out." It was summer, just around dusk. The sun was slipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over everything. I had my headlights on as I pulled into the front of the house. Gravel crunched under my tires, the sound loud in the silence. The place looked even bigger up close, more imposing. The air was still, heavy, like it was waiting for something. We sat there for maybe 10 seconds, just taking it in. There was no movement, no sign that anyone had been there in a long time. No lights, no cars, nothing. Then I put the car in reverse and backed out onto the road. A minute later, that's when we saw the truck. It was big old, with rust creeping along the edges of the hood. Its high beams were on, flooding my rearview mirror with white light. It was close, way too close. At first, I figured it was just some guy in a hurry, maybe annoyed that we had pulled out in front of him. But then he stayed there, right on my ass, not backing off even a little. I felt the first prickle of unease. "Dude, is he?" Eric started, but I cut him off. "I see him." I kept driving, acting like I wasn't bothered, but my grip on the wheel tightened. We reached the light at the intersection. It was red. I signaled right, waiting. The truck didn't move from behind us. The light turned green. I turned. The truck didn't. Instead, it cut through the gas station on the corner, moving fast. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening a second too late. It pulled out in front of us, blocking the road. I hit the brakes hard, the car jerking to a stop. For a second, neither of us moved. The truck just sat there, its engine rumbling. Then, the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was huge. Broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of guy you wouldn't want to piss off. He moved slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The street was empty now. Just minutes ago, it had been busy, but suddenly there was no one. He walked up to my window and rapped on the glass. I rolled it down. The air outside was thick with the smell of oil and something else, something I couldn't place. He leaned down, staring into the car. His eyes moved from me to Eric and back again. "What were you doing at that house?" His voice was calm. Too calm. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I lied, making a U-turn. Silence. He stared at me for a long time. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Then he nodded, took a step back, and waved us on. I didn't wait. I rolled up the window and drove. We didn't say a word until we were miles away, pulling into the parking lot of the movie theater. My hands were still shaking. "What the hell was that?" Eric finally said. "I didn't know, but I never drove past that house again. And to this day, it remains unfinished." I had always thought of myself as a skeptic. I wanted to believe in the things people talked about, ghosts, hauntings, strange occurrences, but I had never seen anything real. If someone told me their house was haunted, I would show up, hoping to see something. If someone claimed they had seen a skinwalker in the woods, I would be the first to grab a flashlight and go looking. It wasn't that I didn't believe people, but every time I went searching, nothing happened. Shadows turned out to be tricks of the light. Strange sounds were just animals or the wind. The stories people told me always seemed to fall apart the moment I started paying attention. But then, something happened that I still can't explain. Something that I haven't been able to shake. It started about a month ago when I went over to my girlfriend's house. I had been there plenty of times before. Her house wasn't old or creepy. It was a regular suburban home, the kind with beige walls, carpeted floors, and a comfortable lived-in feeling. Her mom was nice. Her dad was out of the picture. It was the kind of place that felt normal. That day, when I stepped into the living room, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against me, making it harder to breathe. There was no reason for it. Nothing had changed, except something had. I scanned the room and noticed that an old china cabinet stood against the far wall. It was dark wood, at least 6 feet tall, with glass doors in the front and a mirror backing that reflected the room. I didn't remember it being there before. I mentioned it to my girlfriend, and she told me it had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away a few months ago. She had been bedridden in the hospital for a long time, and my girlfriend had never really talked much about her. I had never met her, never seen a picture of her, never even heard any stories. It wasn't a big deal to me at the time, but standing in front of that cabinet made me feel wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear. It was more like a deep unease, an anxious, almost sorrowful feeling that settled in my chest and refused to leave. It made no sense. It was just a piece of furniture. A collection of teacups, small porcelain dolls, and old trinkets sitting behind glass. Nothing about it should have made me feel anything at all. I told my girlfriend I felt weird about it. She shrugged it off, told me it was probably nothing. Then she went to the bathroom. I was left alone in the living room. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I found myself staring at the cabinet, at the way the glass reflected the light, at the way the mirror in the back seemed to pull the room into itself. It was almost hypnotic. I stepped closer. The glass was old, slightly warped, giving the reflections a distorted, uneven look. The teacups inside had delicate floral patterns. The dolls had wide, unblinking eyes, their tiny faces frozen in expressions that seemed too lifelike. I traced my gaze over them, trying to ignore the unease building inside me. Then I saw it, a shadow in the mirror. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my own reflection. It was a figure, standing behind me, just a dark silhouette, motionless. I turned around fast. Nothing was there. The room was empty. My heart pounded, a sharp, sudden panic rising in my throat. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. That's what I always did when something like this happened. My mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the reflection had picked up something else in the room, something I hadn't noticed before. I was just spooking myself. Then I heard the scream, a sharp, shrill sound coming from the bathroom. I ran. The door was locked. I pounded on it, calling her name, trying to get it to open. When it finally swung open, she was sitting on the floor, shaking, her face pale and streaked with tears. She didn't need to tell me what had happened. I already knew. She had seen something in the mirror too. We didn't stay. We ran out of the house. No shoes, no jackets, just bolted straight to my car and drove. I didn't even know where we were going. I just needed to get away. The drive was a blur. My hands gripped the wheel too tight, my mind racing in circles, trying to rationalize everything. It had to be our imaginations. It had to be stress or exhaustion or some kind of coincidence. But it didn't feel like that. It felt real. Too real. After an hour or so, I finally turned back. When we pulled up to the house, her mom was sitting on the doorstep. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She just looked tired, like she had been waiting for us. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She had been seeing shadows move in the house all night. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. It wasn't just us. It wasn't just in our heads. I didn't stay the night. I didn't even go inside. I dropped my girlfriend off, made sure she was okay, then drove home in silence. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I kept glancing at mirrors, expecting to see something that wasn't supposed to be there. I started avoiding reflective surfaces altogether. Every time I passed by one, I felt my skin crawl, like I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy. A few weeks passed, and my girlfriend told me her mom got rid of the cabinet, donated it somewhere. She didn't want it in the house anymore. I thought that would be the end of it. But even now, I can't forget the way it felt to stand in front of that mirror. The weight of the air, the silence of the room, the moment my own reflection wasn't the only thing staring back at me. I've spent years chasing after things like this, searching for something real. I think I finally found it, and I wish I hadn't. When we first moved into the house I grew up in, I was too young to question anything about it. I was just a kid, maybe 6 or 7, and to me it was just home. A place with walls and a roof. A place with my toys and my bed. It wasn't new, but it wasn't falling apart either. Just an old house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people nod at each other when they walk by, but don't stop to chat. It didn't take long before I started hearing things. The first time, I was sitting on my bedroom floor, surrounded by Legos, trying to build something that actually looked like what was on the box. The house was quiet except for the sound of my own movements. Then I heard my dad call my name. Your name. It came from his room, which was down the hall from mine. His voice was clear, not loud but not a whisper either. Just normal, like he was calling me over to ask for something. I got up and walked to my parents' bedroom, peeking inside. They were both there, my mom reading a book, my dad flipping through channels on the TV. Neither of them looked up. You called me? I asked. They both looked confused. My dad shook his head. No. I stood there for a second, then shrugged and went back to my room. That was the first time. It happened again a few days later. Same situation, sitting alone, playing, lost in my own world. Then my dad's voice called me again. This time, I hesitated before getting up. Something about the way the voice sounded felt off, but I couldn't explain why. Still, I went. Same thing. My parents hadn't called me. At first, I thought maybe they were messing with me, but it kept happening. Sometimes it was my dad's voice. Sometimes my mom's. Sometimes I couldn't even tell exactly which of them it sounded like. Just someone familiar, calling for me. It always came from another room, always when I was alone. It started bothering me. I told my mom about it once, but she brushed it off. Maybe you just think you hear it, she said. Sometimes our brains trick us. But it didn't feel like a trick. Then one night, everything changed. I was in my room, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I had been trying to fall asleep for a while when I heard it again. My dad's voice. Your name. It wasn't coming from his room this time. It was from the living room, all the way on the other side of the house. That was new. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and listened. Then I heard my mom's voice. From my parents' room. Your name. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. I was frozen, gripping my blanket, my whole body suddenly tense. Because I knew. I knew my parents were in their room. I knew they were both there. I hadn't heard them get up. I had just heard my mom call for me. But she was in the other room. I don't remember exactly how long I sat there before finally forcing myself to move. I slid out of bed and walked down the hall to their room. They were exactly where I expected them to be. My dad half asleep, my mom looking at me with a puzzled expression. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask if they had called me. I didn't need to. I already knew the answer. From that point on, I stopped responding. The voices didn't stop, though. They kept calling me. Some nights it was once or twice, some nights not at all. But it always came back. Sometimes I would be brushing my teeth, and I'd hear my dad's voice from the hallway. Sometimes I'd be watching TV, and my mom's voice would come from the kitchen, even though she wasn't home. It wasn't every night, but it was enough. Enough to make me question myself. Enough to make me feel like I was losing my mind. I never told anyone, not really. Then my brother was diagnosed with partial narcolepsy. One of the symptoms? Oral hallucinations. For the first time, I thought maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe I had it too. Maybe that's all it was, just my brain misfiring, making me hear things that weren't there. I went to a doctor. Got checked out. Completely fine. Nothing wrong with me at all. I moved out of that house when I got older, but sometimes when I came back to visit, it would happen again. I'd be lying in bed in my old room, and I'd hear it. My mom's voice, calling for me from the other side of the house. And I'd stay in bed, because I knew she was asleep. And I knew, whatever was calling me wasn't her. I remember the cold bite of the November air that day, the way the wind carried a damp chill that settled into my skin no matter how much I burrowed into my jacket. My father and I had driven out to Manassas battlefield early that morning, more for the sake of killing time than anything else. He had always been interested in history, especially military history, and I had grown up listening to him talk about past wars and battle strategies in the same casual way other people talked about the weather. It wasn't an obsession for him, but more of a quiet respect, something that had deepened after his own time in Vietnam. The battlefield itself stretched out in all directions, its rolling hills and open fields dotted with scattered cannons and historical markers. It wasn't my first time there, but something about that particular visit stuck with me in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the fog, thick and low to the ground, curling around the base of the cannons like something alive. Maybe it was the silence, so heavy and absolute that even the distant sound of traffic seemed muffled and far away. Or maybe it was just the way my father, usually so steady and unmoved by anything, had reacted to what we saw. We had parked on a small hill overlooking a group of cannons, their black iron barrels aimed out over the empty field, as if still waiting for a battle long since fought and lost. My father had backed the truck in so that we could sit on the lowered tailgate, our legs swinging idly as we unwrapped the McDonald's breakfast we had picked up on the way. I remember the waxy feel of the hash brown sleeve in my fingers, the way the steam curled up from the paper as I pulled my sandwich apart. Everything about that moment had been so normal, so mundane, that the strangeness of what happened next felt even more jarring in contrast. At first, I barely noticed the man standing near the cannons. He was just a shape in the mist, a vague figure that didn't immediately register as anything out of place. It wasn't until my father nudged me and gestured toward him that I really looked. The man was standing about 50 to 100 meters away, his posture stiff and unmoving, his right arm lifted in a slow, deliberate wave. Not a casual wave, not the kind you give to someone when you recognize them from a distance, but something else entirely. A beckoning motion, as if he was summoning us over. My father pulled his binoculars from the truck and brought them to his eyes, adjusting the focus with quick, practiced turns. I watched his expression shift as he studied the man more closely. There was a slight furrow between his brows, a small downturn of his mouth that told me he wasn't just looking at a random tourist or reenactor. I reached for the binoculars when he lowered them, pressing them to my own eyes with a sense of growing unease. The man was wearing what looked like a full Civil War-era Confederate uniform, the details so precise and complete that it was almost unsettling. His jacket was buttoned up to his throat, the dull gray fabric worn and creased, his belt fastened tightly around his waist. His hat sat low over his forehead, casting a shadow across his eyes. He didn't move, didn't shift his weight or adjust his stance, just stood there, arms still raised in that slow, methodical wave. My father muttered something under his breath and handed me the binoculars again before hopping off the tailgate. He stretched his shoulders, cracking his neck like he always did when he was about to do something he wasn't sure about. Without a word, he started walking toward the man. I stayed where I was, binoculars still pressed against my face as I tracked his progress. The closer he got, the more something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but there was a tight, knotted feeling in my stomach that hadn't been there before. My father was a tough man, the kind who didn't scare easily, the kind who had seen real combat and come back without a scratch. But as he neared the man, his steps slowed. His posture shifted, shoulders stiffening, head tilting slightly as if listening for something I couldn't hear. From my perspective, nothing changed. The man was still there, still waving, still standing just as solid and real as my father. But then my father stopped walking, completely frozen for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. And then, just as suddenly as he had started walking toward the man, he turned and sprinted back up the hill toward me. I had never seen my father run like that before. He wasn't panicked, exactly, but there was a sharpness to his movements, an urgency that sent a bolt of adrenaline through me before I even understood what was happening. He reached the truck, grabbed everything off the tailgate in a few swift motions, and tossed it into the back without looking at me. I jumped down, heart hammering, and climbed into the passenger seat as he slammed the tailgate shut and yanked open the driver's side door. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, we were peeling away from the hill, tires kicking up damp dirt and gravel as we sped back toward the main road. For a long time, he didn't say anything. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. I knew better than to ask right away, so I just stared out the window, watching as the battlefield blurred past us. It wasn't until we were miles away that he finally exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that sounded more like a release of tension than anything else. He told me later that as he got closer to the man, something had changed. He couldn't explain it, just that the air felt different, heavier somehow, like stepping into a place he wasn't supposed to be. He said the man hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but there was a moment, just before he turned to run, when he realized he wasn't looking at anything at all. That the man, as real as he had seemed from a distance, wasn't really there. But from where I had been sitting, he had never disappeared. I had watched the entire thing through the binoculars, had seen my father standing mere feet from the man before turning and bolting back up the hill. He had been right there the whole time. I don't know what we saw that day. My father doesn't talk about it much, but when he does, there's always that same edge in his voice, that same distant look in his eyes. He isn't the kind of man who scares easily, but something about that moment unsettled him in a way I had never seen before. And sometimes, even now, when I think back on it, I get that same feeling in my stomach. That tight, knotted sense that something wasn't right. That we had stepped too close to something we weren't supposed to see. And I wonder if somewhere out there on that field, someone or something is still standing by those cannons, still waving, still waiting. I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything like that. But what happened to me on a cold December night years ago had nothing to do with the supernatural. It had to do with something much worse, something real. It started with a wrong turn. I had been driving back from my cousin's house, a good 5-hour drive through mostly empty highways and long stretches of trees. I had done this drive before, but that night, I wasn't paying as much attention. My phone had died, and I had no charger. I was relying on my memory to get me home. Somewhere along the way, I must have missed an exit because the road started to look unfamiliar. At first, I didn't think much of it. Highways all looked the same at night, just endless pavement cutting through the dark. But then, I noticed something strange. There were no signs. Not just exit signs, but no mile markers, no speed limit signs, no signs telling me what road I was even on. Just asphalt and trees. And the longer I drove, the more I realized something was off. There were no other cars. Not a single one. That might not seem strange at first, but even in the middle of the night, highways aren't usually completely empty. There's always at least a trucker or two, some late-night driver like me. But I had been driving for nearly an hour, and I hadn't seen a single set of headlights. That's when the uneasy feeling crept in. I told myself I must have taken some old highway, some forgotten back road that wasn't used much. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The road was too well paved, too smooth, like it had just been laid down recently. And then, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A car. Not just any car. My car. Same make, same model, same color. Parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, my heart pounding. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see if anyone was inside. I should have kept driving, but instead I stopped. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought someone needed help. Maybe I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I put my car in park and stepped out into the cold air. My breath came out in clouds as I walked toward the car. The license plate was missing. That's when I hesitated. Everything about the car was identical to mine, except for that. The more I looked at it, the more I felt like I was looking at some kind of mistake, like this car shouldn't be here. Then I heard it, a soft clicking sound. It came from the woods. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw them. Figures, standing just at the edge of the trees. Not moving, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out their faces, but I knew they were looking at me. My whole body went cold. I felt like if I moved too fast, they would do something. The clicking sound got louder. I took a step back. The figures didn't move. I turned and walked quickly back to my car. As soon as I got in and locked the doors, my hands were shaking. I put the car in drive, glancing in the rearview mirror. The figures were still there, but now they were closer. I floored it. The road stretched on endlessly, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look at the speedometer. I just drove, hoping that somehow, someway, I would find my way back to where I was supposed to be. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw something that made my breath hitch. A sign. Not just any sign. A gas station sign. I nearly cried in relief. I pulled into the station and parked under the bright lights. My whole body was still shaking as I got out and walked toward the store. The clerk inside gave me a weird look, but I didn't care. I needed to know where I was. I asked him what road this was. He frowned and told me I was on Highway 47. That wasn't possible. Highway 47 was nowhere near where I had been driving. In fact, it was in the opposite direction of where I should have been. I didn't argue. I just nodded, bought a charger, and went back to my car. When my phone turned on, I checked my location. I had somehow ended up nearly 200 miles away from where I should have been. To this day, I don't know what happened. I don't know what that road was, or why there was a car identical to mine parked there. I don't know who or what those figures were. All I know is that I'm never driving alone at night again. My house sits farther back in the lot than most others. It's one of the first things people notice when they visit. The front yard stretches long, uneven patches of grass breaking up the dirt, making it seem almost forgotten. It's an odd layout too. The sidewalk runs alongside the entire length of the living room and ends at the front porch, which lets directly into the house. No hallway, no transition. Just outside to inside. The living room is the first thing anyone sees when they step in, and those enormous front-facing windows take up most of the wall. They don't open. Never have. The light they let in is great, but at night, it feels like living in a display case. A single lamp, a TV, and the glow of the streetlights outside. That's all that cuts through the darkness. I wasn't thinking about any of that earlier that night. My family was gone on vacation, and I had the house to myself. No work in the morning, no obligations. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I got smashed. Hard liquor, bad decisions. I sat on the couch, half watching some late-night reruns, the volume low enough to let me drift off without thinking too much. By 9 o'clock, I was done. I could barely keep my head up, and the idea of walking down the dark hallway to my room was suddenly unsettling. The couch was fine, comfortable enough. The only downside, it sat right underneath those giant windows. But I was too far gone to care. I don't remember much about falling asleep. Just the sensation of sinking into the cushions, the world fading into a comfortable haze. But waking up, that I remember. I didn't wake up groggy or confused. I woke up alert. Something had pulled me out of my drunken slumber in an instant, and I didn't know what it was. My body was freezing. Not normal cold, but that deep, biting chill that reaches your bones. The kind that makes your breath come out in quick, shaky gasps. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for my brain to catch up to my body. Something felt wrong. Off. Then it started. A loud, solid bang, right above me. My whole body tensed. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't the sound of something falling or settling. It was a fist. Pounding. Hard. The kind of force that said, I know you're in there. My breathing slowed, instinct taking over. I didn't move, didn't sit up. My eyes flicked toward the cable box on the TV stand. The red numbers glowed in the dark. 3:12 a.m. Another bang. This time, I shifted my eyes to the window above me. Someone was standing there. The streetlights behind them threw their figure into silhouette. No details, no features, just a tall, dark shape pressed against the glass. Their arms moved in jerky, aggressive motions, fists hammering against the window. I stayed frozen. My mind screamed at me to move, to hide, to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. The pounding was relentless, vibrating through the glass, through my bones. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence was deafening. My ears rang from the absence of sound, my heartbeat hammering in my chest like a warning drum. I didn't dare move. If I moved, they'd know I was awake. If I moved, I'd break whatever fragile barrier existed between me and them. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then another sound. Bang, bang, bang. Not from the window this time. From the front door. My stomach dropped. There were two of them. One at the window. One at the door. The banging wasn't in sync. One would hit the glass, then, half a second later, the other would slam the door. It was erratic, chaotic, like they were trying to break me down just as much as they were trying to get inside. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every sound felt sharper, louder. The house was too open, the living room too exposed. No curtains, no blinds. I could feel them watching me. I wanted to run, but where? The hallway to my room was pitch black. I'd have to pass the windows to get to the kitchen, and the back door was old, loud when it opened. I was trapped. The pounding continued. A pattern now. Window, door, window, door. The walls felt thinner with every hit, the glass seeming to flex with each impact. I forced myself to stay still, to listen for anything else. No voices, no laughter, no footsteps, just the banging. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there, heart hammering against my ribs, ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. I didn't move. Not for a long time. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. Then an hour. I must have fallen asleep again, my body shutting down from exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, daylight was seeping through the windows. I sat up slowly, my limbs aching from how stiff I had been. The room was eerily silent. The TV was still on, the same infomercial looping. Everything looked untouched. Normal. But it wasn't. I stood up on shaky legs and approached the front door. My hands trembled as I reached for the knob, hesitating before unlocking it. I opened it just a crack, just enough to look outside. The porch was empty. The street quiet. No footprints, no damage. Just the same uneven lawn, the sidewalk cutting through it, leading to the street. I swallowed hard and turned to the window. The glass was clean. No smudges, no handprints. Nothing. I wanted to believe it hadn't happened. That it was some drunken nightmare, some hallucination fueled by bad liquor and an overactive imagination. But I knew better. The fear sitting heavy in my chest wasn't the kind that came from dreams. It was real. Too real. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That two people knocked on my windows and doors, but left no evidence? That I got scared and hid? They wouldn't care. Instead, I called my friend, hoping for some kind of comfort, some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. He laughed, brushed it off. "What the fuck for?" he said when I asked if he'd come over. "So we can both get murdered in our sleep?" I hung up. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. Even now, with my family back, with every door locked and every light on, I still don't sleep well. Because I know, whoever they weren't just some kids messing around. They weren't there to scare me. They were there to get in. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion late at night. I remember it clearly because it was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. The reunion had been good, nothing particularly eventful, just the usual catching up, food, and a few laughs with relatives I only saw a couple of times a year. I had debated staying the night at my aunt's house, where the reunion was held, but I had to be at work early the next morning. The drive was around 2 hours, nothing I hadn't handled before, so I figured I could make it. Most of the drive was on those long, lonely roads that cut through miles of dense forest. You know the kind, endless trees and thick underbrush on either side, barely any streetlights. Just the occasional road sign to remind you that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the darkness. It was the kind of road that always gave me an eerie feeling, even in broad daylight. At night, though, it was something else entirely. The only thing keeping me company was the distant hum of the car engine and the occasional vehicle passing by every few minutes. I had been driving for about 45 minutes when exhaustion hit me out of nowhere. It wasn't gradual. 1 minute, I was fine, and the next, my eyelids felt like they weighed 100 pounds. I blinked hard, trying to shake it off, but the heaviness in my head only got worse. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I sat up straighter in my seat, hoping it would help, but I could feel myself slipping. It was that dangerous kind of tiredness, the kind that creeps up on you and suddenly makes you feel like you're not in control anymore. I knew I had to pull over. Driving like this was asking for an accident, and I didn't want to risk dozing off at the wheel. The problem was there were no real places to stop. No gas stations, no rest stops, not even a wide shoulder to safely park on. The road was narrow, and on either side, there were only trees, bushes, and darkness. Eventually, I made a questionable decision. I slowed the car down, checking my mirrors to make sure no one was behind me, then pulled onto the grass beside the road. I drove a little further into the brush, trying to hide my car from any passing vehicles. I wasn't completely off the road, but I was tucked behind enough bushes that someone speeding past wouldn't immediately see me. I turned off the engine, letting the sudden silence settle around me. The clock on the dashboard read 11:22 p.m. I adjusted my seat, locked the doors, and let out a deep breath. I wasn't planning on sleeping for long, just enough to get some energy back before continuing. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. A sound pulled me from my sleep, a faint scratching noise. It was so light at first that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. My groggy mind barely registered it, and I glanced at the clock. 11:50 p.m. The sound had already stopped. I was still ridiculously tired, and my head felt heavy. Whatever it was, I didn't have the energy to investigate. Maybe a tree branch brushing against the car, or some small animal sniffing around. Either way, I closed my eyes again and let myself drift back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it wasn't so easy to ignore. The scratching noise was back, except this time, it didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like something dragging along the side of my car. My body tensed as I instinctively reached for the lock button on my door, even though it was already locked. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding, trying to listen. The noise was coming from behind me, near the back of the car. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at the clock. 12:40 a.m. Almost an hour had passed since the first sound. I swallowed hard and reached for the rearview mirror, angling it slightly. My eyes scanned the reflection, searching for any sign of movement outside. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees. Then, for a split second, something moved. A blur of motion. Someone, darted away from the back of my car and disappeared into the forest. My entire body went cold. I sat completely still, my breath shallow, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to move, to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen. My mind raced. If it had been an animal, it wouldn't have moved like that. Animals don't run like people. And if it had been a person, then what the hell were they doing lurking around my car in the middle of nowhere? I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I immediately threw the car into drive. My tires spun against the damp grass for a split second before catching traction, and I lurched back onto the road. My heart was hammering as I sped forward, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The road curved ahead, and as I came around the bend, my stomach dropped. There was another car parked on the side of the road. The driver's side door was wide open. I slowed just slightly, my instincts screaming at me to keep going, but my eyes darted toward the car as I passed. No one was inside. Then I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing, just the dark road stretching behind me. But then movement. A figure sprinted around the bend behind me. A man. He was running straight for my car. My foot slammed on the gas before I could even process what was happening. My tires screeched against the pavement as the car shot forward. I didn't dare look back again. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he had been the one scratching at my car or if there had been more than one of them out there. All I know is that I didn't stop driving until I made it home. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in my living room for hours, heart still racing. Sleep didn't come easy that night, or the next. I never went back to that road, and I never, ever pull over to sleep on the side of the road anymore. I didn't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But what happened to my family years ago still sits in the back of my mind, like an itch I can't quite scratch. My mother told me about it not too long ago, but the events themselves happened about 10 years back. At the time, I was just a kid, maybe 10 or 11, and I didn't know much about what had been going on with my aunt, my cousin, or the rest of the family. But now that I do, I can't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. My cousin, let's call her Emma, was 17, maybe 18. She was the kind of person everyone liked. Always smiling, always joking, the type of girl who made friends everywhere she went. She was especially close to my dad's sister, my aunt, and spent a lot of time at her house. She babysat my aunt's kids regularly, 2 little boys no older than 4. They loved her. She was more than just a cousin to them. She was like a big sister. Then the accident happened. It was a car crash. She fought for a while in the hospital, hanging on for a couple of weeks, but in the end, she didn't make it. I remember the funeral. I remember the way my aunt cried, how my dad held her shoulders as she shook, how my uncle stood there like a statue, looking down at the ground. I remember the air being heavy, thick with something I didn't fully understand at the time. Loss, maybe. That hollow feeling when someone who's always been around just isn't. After Emma died, things moved on as they always do. My aunt and uncle were in the middle of renovating their house when it happened. The work had started just before Emma's accident and continued after she passed. Life doesn't stop for grief. The workers kept coming. The hammering, the drilling, the tearing down and rebuilding. It all kept going as if nothing had changed. But then the phone call started. My aunt got the first call on a regular workday. It was one of the construction workers, annoyed about some teenage girl who kept showing up at the house. She didn't think much of it at first, maybe a neighbor's kid, some curious girl sneaking around. But then it happened again, and again. Different workers, same complaint. She keeps walking around the site. She's been here a couple of times this week. Does she live around here? At first, my aunt just brushed it off. Maybe some kid liked exploring construction sites. Maybe she was just bored. But then she asked for a description. Long brown hair, red baseball cap, denim dungarees, white jacket. Her heart must have stopped when she heard that. It was Emma, the exact outfit she used to wear all the time. My aunt went home that evening and found the workers still there, wrapping up for the day. She asked them again about the girl. Yeah, she was just here yesterday. She was walking around the back near the kitchen. She didn't say anything, just kinda wandered. My aunt went inside, grabbed an old photo of Emma, and brought it outside. One by one, the workers looked at it. One by one, they nodded. That's her. None of them knew Emma. None of them had ever seen her before, but they were sure. It was the same girl. My aunt didn't know what to think. The family had never been the type to believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that paranormal stuff. But this was something she couldn't explain. She tried to ignore it. She told herself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was messing with them. Maybe a girl who looked just like Emma just happened to be hanging around their house. But the thing is, this girl never spoke. She never interacted with anyone. She never answered when the workers called out to her. She never acknowledged them at all. And then she stopped coming. Just like that, after a few weeks, the complaints ended. No more sightings. No more mentions of a teenage girl wandering the house. The construction finished. The house was done. My aunt and her family moved back and like nothing had ever happened. But even now, 10 years later, I can see it in my aunt's face when someone brings up Emma. That flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't a ghost. It couldn't have been. So what was it? When I was 8, my family moved from the dense, humid sprawl of South Florida to a small, quiet town in the northern part of the state. The change was immediate and jarring. I was used to traffic, endless neighborhoods, convenience stores on every corner. Suddenly, we were in a place where the roads turned to dirt a few miles from our house, where the nights were darker, quieter, but also filled with noises that were unfamiliar. Rustling in the trees, the distant call of animals I had never heard before. It felt like something out of a Goosebumps book, as if we had unknowingly stepped into the pages of a story where things weren't quite right, where things waited just beyond what you could see. Over the years, strange things happened in that house. Small things at first, things we could explain away. Objects moved, shadows where there shouldn't have been any, doors that had been shut suddenly standing wide open. But nothing serious, nothing that made us think about leaving. We adjusted. My parents, my sister, and we learned to live with it. We joked about it sometimes, in that way people do when they don't want to admit something unnerves them. Then my sister moved out, got married, started her own life. She left our little town behind for a while, but not forever. Life has a way of bringing people back home when they least expect it. Her husband was deployed to Afghanistan, leaving her alone with their newborn son in a trailer on the edge of the woods. She didn't want to be alone, not with a baby. It was too quiet out there, too easy to start imagining things moving in the dark outside her windows. So she came back. At first, it seemed fine. She settled into her old room, but everything had changed. The room she had grown up in wasn't just hers anymore. There was a crib now, a rocking chair in the corner, stacks of diapers and baby clothes where her old posters had once hung. And maybe the house had changed too. Maybe something else had changed. The noises started first. A knocking sound against the wall. Sharp, sudden, like something hitting the headboard of her bed. It wasn't the kind of thing she could easily blame on the house settling. The knocks weren't random. They were deliberate. A noise that made her stop what she was doing, made her listen, made her wait for it to happen again. Sometimes days would go by and nothing would happen. Then, out of nowhere, she'd wake up to it. A loud bang against the headboard. She would lie still, staring into the darkness, holding her breath, waiting to hear it again. It never came twice in a row. Just once. Enough to wake her up. Enough to make her feel like she wasn't alone. She told herself it was just a sound. A strange one, sure, but just a sound. She could live with that. Then, one night, she woke up because something was touching her. It wasn't a dream. She was sure of that. She had been deep in sleep, exhausted from taking care of the baby. And then she was awake, heart pounding, skin prickling. She could feel it. A light, fluttering sensation on her arm. Tickling. A feeling so small, so gentle, that it took her brain a second to process what was happening. And then it was gone. She sat up, wide awake, her whole body rigid. Nothing was there. The room was silent except for the soft breathing of her baby. She didn't tell anyone about it at first. What was there to say? That she had felt something, something that shouldn't have been there? That wouldn't change anything. So she ignored it. She had lived in that house for years before moving out, and nothing had ever actually hurt her. She told herself this was the same thing. Just another one of those strange things that happened in the house sometimes. And then one night she screamed. Not a small, startled noise. Not a groggy, half-awake exclamation. A real, full-bodied, terror-filled scream. The kind of scream that breaks through sleep and forces the people in the house to their feet before they even understand what they're doing. My mom ran to the room, threw open the door, and the bed was moving. Not just shaking, not just shifting. It was rocking, violently, up and down, side to side, like a boat caught in a storm, like someone was underneath it, shoving it, lifting it, trying to tip it over. My sister was still in it, clutching the baby to her chest, her breath coming in gasps, her face pale with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The bed stilled. The air in the room was thick, heavy. The kind of silence that isn't really silence at all. My sister's hands were shaking as she held onto her son, waiting, bracing for something else to happen. But nothing did. The house felt different after that night. Even to me. I didn't live there anymore, but whenever I visited, there was something about it, something I couldn't quite name. A stillness that hadn't been there before. And then one night, something else happened. My sister was nursing her son in the dark. The house was quiet, the baby warm and sleepy in her arms. She was exhausted, her head drooping forward, when something grabbed her ponytail. Not a small tug, not a gentle pull. A yank. Her head snapped back, her scalp stinging, her breath catching in her throat. She froze, gripping the baby tight. And then it yanked again. Hard. She scrambled out of bed, still holding the baby, her heart racing, her hands trembling. She backed against the wall, her breath coming fast, her eyes darting around the room. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew something was there. She could feel it. The baby stirred in her arms, fussing at the sudden movement, but she barely noticed. She was still holding her ponytail, feeling where it had been pulled, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. She wasn't alone for long. My mom heard the commotion, came into the room, and something changed. After that night, the house was quiet again. Nothing moved. Nothing touched her. Nothing yanked her hair or rocked her bed or tickled her in the dark. Whatever had been there, whatever had been watching, it had been warned. It had listened, and it never touched her again. When I was in high school, I had a friend named Ryan. He lived in an older part of town, the kind with big trees that arched over the streets, their branches heavy with leaves in the summer and bare like twisted fingers in the winter. His neighborhood was quiet, mostly older folks, and the houses were all built in the 1950s, solid, charming, craftsman-style homes that had seen generations come and go. But there was one house next to his that never seemed to keep a family for long. It was always for sale. Every few months, a new sign would go up in the front yard, and every time a family moved in, they were gone within half a year, sometimes less. Some left in broad daylight, packing up like it was a normal move, but others disappeared overnight. No moving trucks, no goodbyes, just an empty house the next morning. We were young, stupid, and had too much time on our hands. Ryan had lived next to that house long enough to notice the pattern. We'd joke about it, make up stories about why people left. Murder? Drug lab? Maybe just bad plumbing? No one ever talked about it, and neither did the families that lived there. They left and never looked back. One night, in the dead of winter, we were hanging out at his place, bored out of our minds. It was cold outside, the kind of December chill that seeped into your bones, but inside, his house was warm. We played video games, watched some dumb TV shows, and then just sat there, both feeling that restless energy that comes when there's nothing to do. That's when Ryan got the idea. "The house next door is empty again," he said. "Let's check it out." I remember hesitating. It was one of those moments where you want to say no, but you also don't want to be the one who backs out. I wasn't scared of an empty house, but the idea of breaking in, trespassing, made me feel uneasy. Still, Ryan was already pulling on his jacket, and before I knew it, I was doing the same. We stepped outside into the freezing air. The wind cut through my hoodie, making my skin prickle. The house loomed next door, dark and silent, just like it had been for the past few weeks. The "For Sale" sign swayed slightly in the wind. There were no curtains in the windows, no signs of life. We went around back, our breath visible in the cold air. There was a small wooden deck, the kind that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The back door was locked, but there was a dog door at the bottom. Ryan knelt down, peering through it. "I think I can fit," he muttered. Before I could say anything, he was already squeezing through. His body disappeared into the darkness, and for a moment, I felt a weird sense of panic. Then, after a few seconds, I heard the faint click of a lock turning. The back door creaked open. "Come on," he whispered. I stepped inside, and immediately the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The air was heavy, stale, like the house had been sealed off from the world for years. It smelled like dust, wood, and something else I couldn't place. Not rotting, not mold, but something that made my stomach clench. The house itself was unremarkable. The kitchen had an old-school feel, with a built-in breakfast nook against a large picture window that faced the street. The street lamp outside cast a faint glow through the glass, the only light inside the house. The electricity was off, and without it, everything felt even more lifeless. We sat on the floor near the breakfast table, just talking. Why? I don't know. Maybe because it felt less weird to act like we were just hanging out instead of breaking into a vacant house. The silence around us was thick, pressing in. Every small noise, a shift in the wood, the distant sound of wind, felt amplified. And then Ryan screamed. I didn't have time to react before everything went black. Not the kind of black where your eyes just need to adjust, not like stepping into a dark room. This was total absence. I couldn't see, couldn't feel my body. My skin was engulfed in a cold so intense that it felt like it was sinking into me. like I was being swallowed by something thick and wet. I tried to move, to speak, but nothing worked. Then hands. Ryan's hands. Grabbing me, yanking me with such force that my legs scraped against the floor. My vision started coming back in patches, like an old TV flickering to life. I felt warmth creeping in, the cold peeling away. Suddenly, we were outside. The streetlight above us buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over Ryan's pale face. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. My heart slammed against my ribs. We stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking. I was shaking, my limbs still numb. My mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I turned to him. His face was still twisted with fear. What happened? I managed to croak. Ryan swallowed hard, his eyes darting back to the house. His hands were still clenched into fists. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. There was something, under the table. I stared at him. A girl, or something shaped like one. My stomach twisted. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that he was messing with me, but I knew, I knew, that whatever had just happened wasn't in his head. It wasn't in mine either. He took a deep breath, his shoulders trembling. It crawled out, just slid out from under the table while you were talking, and then it climbed onto you. I felt my body lock up. You didn't see it? He asked. I shook my head. I had felt it though. The cold, the blindness, the suffocating blackness. Neither of us said another word. We just turned and walked back to his house, closing the door behind us, locking it. The warmth inside didn't touch the cold I still felt in my bones. For days after that, I felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. Like when you know someone is staring at you in a crowded room. Except this wasn't a crowded room. It was everywhere. I avoided the house after that. If I was at Ryan's, I wouldn't even glance in its direction. Months passed. Eventually, another family moved in. And just like before, they were gone in less than 6 months. I never found out why. I never wanted to. Even now, years later, I can still remember the way that cold felt. How thick and real it was. How I couldn't see, couldn't move. Whatever was in that house, whatever was under that table, it was real. And I don't ever want to feel it again. "3:34 a.m. I wake up. The first thing I see is the glowing red numbers on my clock. 3:34 a.m. The room is dark, the kind of blackness that feels thick, like a presence pressing in from all sides. My blankets are twisted around me, damp with sweat. My breathing is fast, too fast. I don't even know what woke me up. Then I hear it. A noise from downstairs. A rattling sound. I freeze, my ears straining. At first, I think maybe it's the heater, the pipes clanking like they sometimes do when the temperature shifts. But this is different. It's not mechanical. It's deliberate. Like something or someone is moving around down there. I hold my breath. The darkness suddenly feels heavier. The air is too still, like the whole house is holding its breath with me. I tell myself it's nothing, but my body doesn't believe me. My skin is tingling with fear, my stomach twisting in knots. Every nerve in my body is screaming at me. Something is wrong. Slowly, carefully, I slip out of bed. The floor is cold under my feet. I move as quietly as I can, barely breathing. My parents' room is just down the hall. If someone broke in, I need to wake them up. But when I reach their bedroom door, something stops me. The door is open, wide open. I peek inside. The bed is empty. No mom, no dad. The sheets are still pulled back, like they had just gotten up. But where would they go at 3:34 in the morning? A deep unease crawls up my spine. I swallow hard and turn back into the hallway, my heart pounding. Maybe they're in my brother's room. He stays up all night playing video games. If something weird was happening, he'd know. I make my way upstairs, my breath shallow. The staircase creaks beneath me, and I flinch, pausing for a second to listen. Nothing. When I reach my brother's door, I see the light is on. Relief washes over me for a brief second. But when I push the door open, the room is empty. The computer screen is glowing. His chair is slightly pulled back, like he just left. My heart rate picks up again. Something doesn't make sense. First my parents, now my brother. The rattling noise downstairs. It has to be them, right? Maybe something happened. Maybe someone died. A family emergency. I need to check. I move back down the stairs, slow and cautious. gripping the banister so tight my knuckles turn white. When I reach the bottom, I stop. In the middle of the living room, two men are standing in front of our TV. Strangers. They're moving fast, working together, unhooking cables, and shoving things into bags. They're stealing from us. My heart is hammering so hard it hurts. I don't make a sound. I just turn and run. Up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, trying to stay quiet. My bedroom is my only safe place. My hands are shaking as I reach my door, step inside, and shut it behind me. I lock it. A second later, the banging starts. Fists slamming against the wood. I wake up. My body jerks, and my eyes fly open. My sheets are tangled around me. I can hear my pulse in my ears. I look at my clock. 3:34 a.m. For a moment, all I feel is relief. It was a dream. Just a dream. I take deep breaths, my body still shaking, trying to calm down. But it felt so real. My parents missing. My brother gone. The men downstairs. The banging on my door. I sit up, rub my face, try to shake the lingering fear. I know the best way to deal with nightmares. I've been lucid dreaming since I was a teenager. I know how to take control. The best way to prove to myself that I'm awake is to get up and do something normal. So I decide to go downstairs. I get out of bed, stepping carefully this time, but the floor still feels cold under my feet. I glance at the clock again. 3:34 a.m. I shake my head. Just a coincidence. I step out into the hallway. Everything looks normal. The doors are shut. No eerie silence. No heavy air pressing down on me. But when I get to the stairs, I hear it. Voices. Not quiet ones. Loud. Angry. My stomach twists as I move closer. When I reach the bottom of the stairs, I freeze. The 2 men are standing in my kitchen. But they aren't stealing this time. They're screaming at my parents and my brother. Mom's hands are raised. My dad's face is pale. My brother looks frozen, barely breathing. I don't know what's happening, but I know I shouldn't be here. I turn and run. Upstairs. My bedroom. I shut the door. I lock it. And then, bang, bang, bang. The sound rattles my door. I wake up. 3:34 a.m. I stare at the clock, my chest rising and falling too fast. My brain is scrambled, trying to piece together what's happening. I just woke up. Again, I know this feeling. Nested dreams. I've had them before. The sensation of waking up, only to find out you're still dreaming. But something about this one feels worse. I don't move this time. I just sit there, gripping my blanket, afraid to even blink. I wait. The house is quiet now. No rattling downstairs. No voices. No banging. I glance at my bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happens. I don't sleep again that night, or the next. By the time I finally drift off, it's been over 36 hours. And when I wake up, I don't check the clock. A few summers ago, I went for a bike ride around midnight with a friend. It was one of those warm, sticky nights where the air feels thick, and the hum of the city quiets just enough to make everything seem a little eerie. We had spent the evening biking around the quieter streets of downtown, weaving through empty intersections, past closed-up storefronts, the neon signs buzzing in the silence. It was peaceful in that way only late-night summer rides can be, until it wasn't. At the end of the ride, we split off. My friend lived in the opposite direction, and I only had 2 blocks left to go before I'd be home. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. I'd done this ride 100 times before. But that night, there was construction along my usual route. The street was torn up, blocked off by barriers and orange cones, so I had no choice but to take the sidewalk. The streets were dead. Not a single car, not another person in sight, except for him. I noticed him when I was about half a block away. A man, maybe in his 40s, walking alone. He wasn't exactly disheveled, but there was something off about him. He had that look, scruffy but not quite homeless, the kind of person who blends in during the day, but at night, alone, something about them feels different. The sidewalk was narrow, and I didn't want to startle him, so as I got closer, I called out, "Hey, behind you." It was meant to be polite, a simple warning, so he wouldn't get spooked as I passed. But when he turned around, the look he gave me made my stomach drop. His face twisted with anger, his eyes dark and wild. His lip curled, his whole expression burning with something I didn't understand. For a split second, I regretted saying anything at all. I turned down my street, hoping that would be the end of it. Then I heard him, screaming. At first, I didn't even process the words. Just the raw, furious sound of his voice, the way it cut through the stillness of the night like a knife. But then the words hit me. "You fucking cunt. I'll kill you. I'll fucking kill you." I pedaled faster. My house was right off the corner, too close. Too easy for him to see me go inside, to know exactly where I lived. I made a split-second decision. I didn't go home. Instead, I kept going, turning down the next street to loop around the block. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I listened for footsteps, for the sound of him running after me, but the blood rushing in my ears drowned out everything else. When I finally came back around to my street, I slowed down, glancing toward my house. That's when I saw him, standing on my front stoop. He wasn't yelling anymore. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, waiting, staring out at the street like he already knew. He knew I lived there. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't stop. I didn't even let my eyes linger on him for more than a second. I just kept riding, past my house, past everything, back toward my friend's place. I didn't go home that night. I ended up staying at my friend's for a few hours, just waiting, hoping he'd leave. I texted my mom, but she told me not to call the police. Said it was probably just some crazy guy, that he'd be gone by morning. I waited until just before sunrise, when the sky was starting to lighten, and then cautiously rode back home. My hands were shaking the whole way. I kept expecting to see him again, lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. I told myself it was over, and maybe it was, at least until 2 days later. That's when my bike was stolen. I'd left it in the alleyway by our house, locked up but not inside. Someone had cut the lock clean through. It could have been a coincidence. Downtown was full of people looking for an easy steal. But after what happened that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that he had come back, that he had taken something from me. I never saw him again after that. But even now, years later, I still think about it. About that night. About the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. And the worst part, I still don't know what would have happened if I had gone home that night. I was 13, maybe 14. It was around summer, and in my small town, there wasn't much to do other than skateboard, hang out with friends, and wander around to pass the time. My two closest friends, Tim and Brandon, and I spent most of our afternoons at the local skate spots, grinding curbs, attempting tricks, and just wasting time the way kids do. That day wasn't any different. We had been skating for hours, sweating in the sun, and by the time we decided to call it quits, we were exhausted. The nearest July 11th was only a short skate away, so we figured we'd grab something to drink before heading home. We weren't driving yet, too young for that, so we always relied on our boards or just walked wherever we needed to go. The town was small enough that skating everywhere was normal. Everyone knew everyone, but that never made it feel completely safe. The three of us rolled into 7-Eleven, the automatic doors sliding open with that familiar ding. The cold air inside was a relief after the heat outside. I grabbed a Mountain Dew, Brandon got some energy drink, and Tim picked up a big bottle of water. We paid, joked around a little, and stepped back out into the warm air, sipping our drinks. We headed toward the parking lot exit, standing at the edge of the road, waiting for the traffic light to turn red so we could cross. The highway wasn't exactly busy, but cars passed through regularly. We stood there, laughing about something stupid, when, out of nowhere, I felt something. That feeling you get when someone's staring at you. I glanced back at the gas pumps. There was a man, maybe mid-40s to early 50s, standing beside a white pickup truck, filling his tank. His clothes were dirty, almost like a mechanic's, and his face was tanned and weathered. His eyes, though, that's what made my stomach drop. He was just staring at me, not moving, not blinking. Just staring. The moment my eyes met his, everything changed. He let go of the pump, the nozzle dropping against the pavement, fuel still spilling from it. Without hesitating, he yanked open his truck door, jumped in, and slammed on the gas. The tires screeched as the truck shot forward, straight at us. For a split second, I froze. My mind didn't catch up to what was happening. It wasn't until Brandon shouted, "Holy shit," that I snapped out of it. I barely moved in time. The truck missed me by inches, but I felt the side mirror graze my arm. My skateboard flew out of my hand and hit the pavement. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward. I heard Brandon yell something, probably swearing at the guy, but I was too stunned to process it. The truck didn't stop. Instead, he peeled out of the parking lot, tires screaming, and swerved into the lot next to 7-Eleven. That's when I realized he wasn't done. There was a ditch between the two parking lots, nothing huge, but deep enough that no normal person would try to drive through it. He didn't care. He floored it, sending the truck crashing into the ditch and up into the other parking lot, coming straight for us again. Panic hit me like a punch to the chest. I turned and ran. So did Tim and Brandon. We sprinted across the highway without looking, our feet pounding the pavement as we tore down the street. I didn't know where I was running, just away. The local library was only a couple of blocks from July 11th. We instinctively ran toward it, but halfway there, I risked a glance back. The truck was still coming. Fast. That's when I made the decision. Tim and Brandon were heading straight for the library, but I veered off. I knew it was closed, it was Sunday, but more importantly, I knew the woods behind it. There was a trail that led almost directly to my backyard. My legs burned as I sprinted, breathing hard, my heartbeat so loud in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. I didn't dare look back again. When I reached the tree line, I finally heard tires screeching, doors slamming. I turned my head just enough to see the man jump out of his truck. He was chasing me. I hadn't processed that before. I thought maybe he was after all of us, but no. He was running straight in my direction. In his hand, he held something. I couldn't tell if it was a shotgun or a crowbar. My vision was blurred by sweat and panic, but it didn't matter. I wasn't stopping to get a better look. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, tearing down the dirt trail, branches whipping at my face and arms. The path twisted and turned, and I kept expecting to hear him behind me, hear his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, but I didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I made it home, my lungs were on fire, my legs shaking. The moment I reached my street, I saw my neighbor, Tim's dad, outside. He must have seen me sprinting, because he immediately called me over. "Get in the car," he said. I didn't ask why. I just got in. My mind was racing, my hands shaking. He told me we were going to the video store, where Tim's mom worked. When we got there, I saw Tim and Brandon. They were with the police. And my mom. The second she saw me, she broke down. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, but I didn't complain. I had no idea they all thought I was dead. Apparently, Tim and Brandon had reached the store, out of breath, and told everyone what happened. When they got to the part where I ran into the woods, they realized they didn't know if I ever made it out. That's when the cops were called. I told them everything I could, but it didn't matter. The guy was gone. No one caught him. They said they'd look into it. But I never heard anything after that. For the next 5 years, every time I saw a white truck, my stomach twisted into knots. I spent so many nights lying in bed, wondering what would have happened if I had tripped, if I had been just a little bit slower. And the worst part, there were people everywhere that day. Dozens of them. At the gas station. At the stores nearby. People saw what was happening, and no one did a damn thing. That's the part that still haunts me. I got home from work a little later than usual, feeling the familiar exhaustion settle in my bones as I dropped my bag by the door of my room. It had been one of those days that dragged on, where every minute felt like an hour, and by the time I finally clocked out, my patience had worn thin. The second-floor bedroom was my retreat, the place I went to unwind and shut out the rest of the world. Downstairs, my little brother had the TV on, the sound drifting up through the floor, a mix of voices and background noise that blurred together. I barely paid attention to whatever he was watching, just grateful that he was keeping himself entertained. It was our usual evening routine, me upstairs, him downstairs, the dog somewhere in between, acting as the unspoken guardian of the house. The dog, a medium-sized mutt with more energy than common sense, had been dozing off in the hallway outside my door. She was always nearby, loyal to a fault, the kind of dog that followed you from room to room just to make sure you were still there. When she was sleeping, she was dead to the world, barely moving unless something truly interesting happened. That's why the sudden explosion of noise caught me completely off guard. 1 second, everything was calm. The next, the dog was in a frenzy. Nails clacked against the hardwood floor as she jumped around, barking loud enough to shake the walls. Her howls cut through the air, sharp and frantic, like she'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. The suddenness of it jolted me out of my half-asleep state, my heart kicking up a notch. I was already pushing myself up from my bed when I heard it. A man's voice. "Ah, that's a good girl." It was casual, like someone had just walked in and greeted the dog in passing. The tone was calm, familiar, like whoever it was had done this 100 times before. But something was off. It wasn't my little brother. The voice was deeper than his, too mature, too steady. And it wasn't our dad's friend, the guy who rented the spare room downstairs. He wasn't even supposed to be home yet. My first instinct wasn't fear. It was confusion. "Oh, you're home early." The words left my mouth automatically as I stepped toward the door, still half convinced that it had to be our roommate. Who else could it be? I pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The dog stood in the middle of it, tail wagging, staring at the far end like someone was still standing there. But there was no one. No shadow, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The air felt wrong. Not cold, not eerie, just wrong. Like I had walked into a conversation that had already ended, like I had missed something by just a second or two. My mind struggled to make sense of it, to connect the dots in a way that didn't lead to an answer I didn't want. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. My little brother. He came up fast, face twisted in irritation. He had that look he always got when something had interrupted him, like he was about to accuse me of ruining his evening. "What the hell, dude? Why'd you get the dog all riled up?" I stared at him. "I didn't." He frowned. "Then who said that?" And just like that, the unease solidified into something heavier. He had heard it too. We stood there for a second, neither of us saying anything. The dog's tail slowed, ears twitching like she was still listening to something we couldn't hear. I glanced at the staircase, then back down the hallway. The layout of our house wasn't complicated. 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, 1 downstairs, 2 upstairs. The stairs led straight into the small living room, connected to the kitchen by a narrow doorway. There weren't a lot of places to hide. If someone had been inside, we would have seen them by now. But the voice had been real. I looked at my brother. He looked at me. Neither of us needed to say it. We had to check the house. I went back into my room, grabbed the butterfly knife I kept in my dresser. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My brother disappeared into his room for a second and came back out with his BB gun. Not exactly intimidating, but at least we weren't going in empty-handed. We moved together, slow and cautious, every creak of the floor beneath us making my pulse jump. The dog stayed close, her body language alert, but not afraid. If there had been a real threat, I knew she'd be acting differently. That thought was the only thing keeping my nerves from completely unraveling. First, we checked our roommate's room. Empty. The bed was undisturbed, the chair still pulled out from the desk the way he always left it. His work boots were by the door, untouched. If he had come home early, there would have been signs. But there was nothing. We checked the bathroom. Nothing. Then the closets. Nothing. One by one, we went through every room, every hiding place, every corner where someone could have squeezed themselves in. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. The windows were closed. No one was in the house. By the time we finished the once-over, my hands were shaking. My brother exhaled sharply, the kind of breath that sounded more like he was forcing himself to stay calm than anything else. We went back upstairs. The dog had already settled back down, curling up near my doorway like nothing had happened. I stared at the hallway again, at the exact spot where she had been looking. The house was silent now, the way it had been before all of this started. The voice echoed in my head, looping over and over. "Ah, that's a good girl." It had been so clear. Not muffled, not distant, not like something I had misheard over the TV. It had been right there, right outside my door, and there was no way to explain it. The rest of the night felt uneasy, like the house itself had changed, like the air inside it wasn't the same. We didn't talk about it much, didn't try to rationalize it. What was there to say? We had both heard it. It wasn't a trick of the mind, wasn't our imagination playing games. But there was no one in the house. And to this day, I still don't know what to make of that. It was late at night, and I was home alone. That wasn't unusual for me, but I never really got used to it. There was always a lingering feeling of unease, a quiet kind of tension that settled in my chest whenever the sun went down, and I was the only one in the house. I'd tell myself it was just my imagination, just my brain playing tricks on me, but that didn't stop me from double-checking the locks before I settled in for the night. That night, I had done exactly that. I went through my usual routine, locked the front and back doors, checked the windows, and made sure the curtains were drawn. It wasn't paranoia, just caution. The world could be unpredictable, and I had no interest in taking chances. After making sure everything was secure, I settled into the couch in the living room and turned on the TV. The glow of the screen cast flickering light across the walls, making the room feel a little less empty. The sound of the show I was watching filled the silence, pushing back the quiet in a way that made me feel a little less alone. I wasn't really paying much attention to what was on the screen. It was just background noise, something to distract me from the stillness of the house. I was comfortable, warm under a blanket, half focused on the images flashing in front of me. My body had relaxed, my mind drifting into that half-aware state where I wasn't quite paying attention to my surroundings anymore. Then the doorbell rang. The sound shattered the quiet, cutting through the false sense of security I had built around myself. My body tensed immediately, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was late, too late for anyone to be dropping by unannounced. My first thought was that maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was someone who had the wrong house, someone delivering food or looking for a friend. But even as I tried to reason with myself, my body stayed rigid, frozen in place on the couch. The doorbell rang again. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I stayed perfectly still, listening. No knocking, no voices calling out, just the faint hum of the TV and the ringing in my ears. Slowly, I pushed the blanket off of me and got to my feet, moving cautiously toward the front door. I was careful, stepping lightly, avoiding the spots in the floor that creaked. I didn't turn on the porch light. I didn't want whoever was outside to know I was home, just in case. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My heart was pounding, my pulse quick in my wrists and throat. I didn't know why I was so scared. It was probably nothing. Still, I moved carefully, pressing my eye to the peephole without making a sound. At first, I couldn't see anything. The porch was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a street lamp further down the road. My eyes adjusted, slowly picking out shapes in the darkness. And then I saw it. A small figure, no taller than 3 or 4 feet, standing just beyond the threshold of the porch light's reach. At first, my mind struggled to process what I was looking at. It wasn't shaped like a person, at least not exactly. It was dark, so dark that it stood out even against the night around it. The best way I could describe it was like a shadow that was somehow more solid than the darkness surrounding it. And it was moving. It wasn't standing still. It was dancing. Not a normal dance, not something that made sense. It was dipping down, bending at the knees, then spreading its arms out wide in a slow, fluid motion. Its movements were unnatural, too smooth, like something mimicking a person but not quite getting it right. My stomach twisted. I watched it sway, watched the way its arms moved in wide, sweeping arcs, like wings stretching out and folding back in. It was hypnotic in a way, and for a few long seconds, I couldn't look away. Then something in me snapped, and I jerked back from the peephole, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't want to look again. I didn't want to see it, but the not knowing was worse. I forced myself to press my eye back to the peephole. The porch was empty. The figure was gone. I stayed frozen for a long time, waiting, straining to hear any sound from outside. My hands were shaking, and I realized I had been holding my breath. After what felt like forever, I exhaled, stepping away from the door. I checked the locks again, made sure the windows were still closed. Nothing else happened that night. No more knocking, no more ringing doorbells, no more movement outside. But I didn't sleep. Even now, years later, I still don't know what I saw. I tell myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, that it was some kind of weird optical illusion caused by the darkness. But deep down, I don't believe that, because the way it moved, so smooth, so deliberate, felt too real. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the house is too quiet, I wonder if it will come back. I was 4, maybe 5. It was the middle of summer, the kind of night where the air was thick and everything outside felt close. The apartment my mom and I lived in was small, just 2 bedrooms, a hallway, a kitchen, and a living room. We were on the ground floor of a building that looked like every other one in the complex. Rows of identical doors, a shared parking lot, patches of grass that turned yellow in the heat. Nothing about it stood out. Nothing about it felt unsafe. My mom and dad had just separated. It had only been a few months, and though I had my own room, I rarely slept there. I was still too young to feel comfortable in a bed by myself, still too attached to the feeling of having her close. On the nights I stayed with her, I always climbed into her bed. She never stopped me. The bedroom was small, just big enough for a dresser, a nightstand, and the bed we shared. The window sat directly behind the headboard, and my mom always left it open a little to let in air. There was a screen, but no bars, no locks beyond the flimsy latch meant to keep out insects. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. That night, I woke up suddenly. I don't remember what stirred me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway where the glow of a street lamp outside bled in through the blinds. The apartment was silent, the kind of deep quiet that makes even the smallest noises feel loud. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, trying to figure out why I was awake. That's when I noticed the cat. He was sitting in the doorway of my mom's room, his body still, his ears pricked forward, his tail curled around his paws. He was staring toward my bedroom, his gaze locked on something I couldn't see from where I sat. That was strange. Normally, he would be curled up in bed with us, a warm lump at the foot of the blankets. He never just sat in the hallway like that. I watched as he slowly got up, stretched, then padded into my bedroom. He paused just inside the doorway and let out a single sharp meow. Something about it made my skin prickle. It wasn't the usual soft sound he made when he wanted attention. It was sharper, more alert. A sound meant to get someone's notice. I turned toward my mom, shifting on the mattress, reaching out to shake her awake. I didn't even have to say anything. She must have sensed something in my movement, something in the air of the room. She blinked awake fast, eyes immediately flicking to my face. In the few seconds it took for her to focus, I turned back toward the door. There was a man. He was standing just outside my bedroom, half in shadow, half illuminated by the dim yellow light from the window. I could see the shape of him clearly, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. He was turned slightly, his body angled toward the hallway, as if he had just stepped out of my room, as if he had been inside. I couldn't move. I didn't even have time to be scared, not in a way that made sense. It was just a raw, freezing sensation that spread through my whole body. Then my mom moved. I didn't see her decide to act. 1 second, she was beside me, and the next I was weightless, flying through the air. She had grabbed me and thrown me straight through the window. The screen gave way easily, the thin metal bending as I crashed through it. I landed hard on the grass outside, my hands scraping against the ground. My mom was right behind me, moving so fast it was like she hadn't even thought about it. The second she hit the ground, she started screaming. The sound tore through the night, sharp and panicked. I scrambled to my feet, my heart slamming so hard it hurt. The apartment complex was mostly quiet, but lights started flicking on in the windows around us. Somewhere, a dog started barking. My mom grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the parking lot. She didn't stop screaming. I don't remember how long it took for help to come. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. It felt endless, like we were trapped in the wide open dark with nothing but the sound of her voice and my own breathing. When the police arrived, we were still outside, standing in the middle of the lot. My mom wouldn't let go of me. She was shaking, her grip so tight it hurt. The officers went inside, checking every room, every closet, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry. The only thing they found was the front door unlocked. My mom swore she had locked it. Deadbolt, chain, everything. She was certain, but there was no way to prove it. They took a statement, walked around the building, shined their flashlights into the bushes. In the end, all they could do was tell us to be careful, to make sure the locks were secure, to call if anything else happened. For days after, my mom barely slept. She kept the windows shut tight, checked the locks over and over. I stayed with her in bed every night. A week later, she found the notebook. She had been cleaning the kitchen, wiping down the counters, straightening up the cabinets. When she opened the water heater closet, she noticed something shoved into the corner of the small space, half hidden behind the pipes. A notebook, a pair of gloves, some old gum wrappers. The notebook was filled with names, strange drawings, scribbled notes that didn't make sense. She didn't touch anything. She just backed away, her breath coming fast, and called the police. When they arrived, they looked through the notebook, flipped through the pages. But there wasn't much they could do. The items had no identifying information, no clear connection to anyone. The only explanation they could offer was the one neither of us wanted to hear. Someone had been inside, maybe for days, maybe longer. Someone had been hiding. And that night, the night I woke up, the night the cat had seen something before I did, that had been the night he decided to leave. But he had been there, long enough to leave behind pieces of himself, long enough to be comfortable. After that, we didn't stay in the apartment much longer. My mom broke the lease early, packed up our things, and we moved in with my grandmother. For years, I had nightmares about it, about the man in the doorway, about the notebook, about the possibility that he had been watching us sleep long before we ever knew he was there. I never slept with the window open again. I always loved weekends as a kid. My parents were the best. They let me sleep in the living room on Friday and Saturday nights, knowing I loved staying up late. My sister, a light sleeper, couldn't stand the TV murmuring in the background, so it worked out for everyone. I'd sprawl on the couch, flipping through channels, finally settling on Nick at night reruns, my little ritual. The glow of the screen, the hum of the television, the soft creak of the house settling. It was all so familiar, so safe. At some point, I'd always drift off, cocooned in a blanket, the static of the late-night sitcoms lulling me to sleep. That night was no different, until I woke up. It wasn't the usual kind of waking up. Not the slow, groggy kind where you roll over and try to get comfortable again. This was different. My eyes snapped open, and my body went rigid before my brain even had time to catch up. It was that feeling, the one where something isn't right. Like my body had already sensed the danger before I fully understood it. A prickly sensation ran up my arms, my spine. The living room was dark, but the moonlight outside cast a soft glow through the front window. Without thinking, I bolted upright on the couch and turned to face it. I could see everything outside. The long gravel driveway, the tree line in the distance, and most of all, the massive oak tree that stood just past the front yard. It had always been there, its thick branches stretching toward the sky, its roots twisting deep into the ground like something ancient. I knew that tree. I had seen it every day of my life, but I had never seen someone in it. In the pale light of the moon, I saw the outline of a person, a dark silhouette, perched in the thick branches, sitting there like it belonged. My stomach clenched. My breath hitched. The family dog, a mutt we'd had since I was little, sprang to life before I could even react. He dashed to the window, his body tense, snarling deep in his throat. The sound was raw, angry, nothing like his usual barking at squirrels or the neighbor's cat. His fur bristled, his lips peeled back over his teeth, and he growled so fiercely that spit flecked the glass. The figure in the tree didn't move. I was frozen. My brain screamed at me to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I don't know how long I sat there, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I tore through the house, straight to my parents' room, my legs barely holding me up. My hands slammed against their door, fumbling with the knob before I finally pushed it open. My dad didn't even hesitate. He was out of bed in an instant, grabbing something from the nightstand before storming toward the front door. The dogs followed, their nails clicking against the hardwood floor. I stayed behind, trembling in my mother's arms, trying to explain between gasps that there was a man in the tree. I heard the front door swing open. The night swallowed my dad whole. We waited. I don't think I breathed the entire time. Eventually, Dad came back inside. His face was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw told me everything. He hadn't found anyone. He checked the yard, the driveway, the woods, but there was nothing. The tree was empty. He locked the doors, told me to go to bed. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I didn't want to be in that living room anymore, not with the image of that shadow burned into my brain. I went to my bedroom, my legs still shaky. My sister was already half awake when I climbed into my bed. I whispered what happened, my voice barely above a breath. She didn't say much, just turned over, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Maybe she didn't believe me. Maybe she did. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the fear to pass. It didn't. My dad was still awake, pacing through the house with a cup of coffee. I could hear the floorboards creaking under his weight, his footsteps slow and steady. He was keeping watch. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. Then I felt it. That same instinct. I cracked my eyes open, dread settling deep in my stomach. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head toward the window. And there he was, a man, standing just beyond the glass. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the pale moonlight, half hidden in the shadows. His features were blurred, but I could see enough. I could see the tilt of his head, the way his hands hung at his sides. And then, he raised one finger to his lips. A slow, deliberate motion. Shh. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My body locked up, my mind spiraling. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he turned. No hesitation, no rush. Just turned and walked away. Not toward the trees. Not toward a car. Just straight ahead, as if he had somewhere else to be. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, tears streaming down my face. By morning, there was no trace of him. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. My dad didn't say much when I told him what I saw. Just nodded, his face grim. He started keeping the shotgun closer after that. And I never slept in the living room again. Last summer, I was back at my parents' house for the holidays. I hadn't been home in a while, so I was enjoying the quiet, familiar space of my childhood bedroom. It was late, around 3 a.m. The house was silent except for the faint hum of my computer as I sat at my desk, scrolling mindlessly. The only light came from my screen, casting a soft glow on the walls. That's when my phone rang. The sound was jarring in the stillness, and I jumped a little before looking at the caller ID. It was my sister. That was weird. Her room was just down the hallway. If she needed something, she could have just walked over. I hesitated for a second before reaching for my phone, but as soon as my thumb hovered over the screen, the call ended. I stared at my phone for a moment, confused. Maybe she had pocket-dialed me, but that didn't make sense. She was probably asleep. Still, something about it unsettled me. A feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. I got up and stepped into the hallway. The air was cooler out here, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet. My sister's door was closed. I knocked gently. No response. I knocked again, a little louder this time. The scream that followed froze me in place. It was raw, panicked, and cut through the silence of the house like a knife. I didn't think. I just acted. My hand shot for the doorknob, and I shoved the door open. She was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror, clutching the blankets close to her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps. I scanned the room instinctively, heart pounding. Nothing. There was no one there. She was still shaking when I reached her. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to get her to calm down. Eventually, between deep, shuddering breaths, she told me what happened. She had woken up to see a dark figure standing inches from her face. Not at the foot of the bed, not near the window, right there in front of her, close enough that she should have felt its breath, if it had one. And the moment she screamed, it was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a sleep paralysis hallucination. Maybe a shadow from the streetlights outside. But her window was covered by thick curtains, and she swore she could feel something there. Watching her, then I remembered the call. I pulled out my phone and showed her the log. You called me right before you screamed. She shook her head. Her phone wasn't in her room. She was so sure of it that we went downstairs to check. Her purse was sitting by the front door, untouched. When she pulled out her phone, there was no record of a call to me. No outgoing call. No missed call. Nothing. But mine still showed her name, the timestamp clear as day. That was the moment I felt it. A cold, creeping unease that settled deep in my bones. I didn't know what to make of it. Neither did she. We stayed in the living room for a while, both too uneasy to go back to our rooms. Eventually, exhaustion won, and we crashed on the couches. The next morning, in the daylight, it felt surreal. Like maybe we had overreacted. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But when I went back to my room and looked at my phone again, the call log was still there. A reminder that something had happened. Something I still can't explain. I hadn't wanted to come in the first place. The cabin belonged to my uncle, more of a hunting lodge than a vacation spot. It sat deep in the woods, hours away from the nearest town. No cell service, no internet, no electricity beyond the generator, and a single well for water. He'd built it years ago, a place to escape for a few weeks during hunting season. The place had been sitting empty most of the year since he got older and started traveling more, but he still insisted it was the perfect getaway. I had no interest in hunting, but after weeks of pressure from my uncle, my dad, and even my cousins, I finally gave in. A weekend in the woods, alone, just to prove to them that I wasn't some city-soft idiot who couldn't handle being by myself. The drive up took nearly 4 hours, mostly on rough dirt roads that wound through thick forests of pine and birch. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set behind the trees. The place was exactly as I remembered it from years ago, a dark wooden structure with a green metal roof, a wide front porch, and a stone chimney jutting up one side. A small clearing surrounded it, but beyond that, the forest pressed in tight. I pulled my truck close, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No sounds except for the occasional rustling in the underbrush. No distant traffic, no voices, no hum of civilization. Just silence. I got out and stretched. My uncle had warned me about bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf passing through. Keep food locked up, don't wander too far at night, and if I heard anything strange, don't investigate. Solid advice, and I intended to follow it. The cabin's door was locked with an old brass key my uncle had mailed me. I unlocked it and stepped inside. It smelled like wood smoke and dust. The main room was simple, a wood stove in one corner, a worn couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs. A single hallway led to a bathroom and a small bedroom with a twin bed and a dresser. I set my bags down and got to work. First, I hauled in firewood from the covered pile outside, stacking it near the stove. Then I started the generator, filling the place with the low hum of power. A single dim bulb flickered to life in the kitchen. I ate a quick meal, canned soup heated on the propane stove, then stepped outside to take in the night. The stars were brilliant, completely untouched by light pollution. The forest felt impossibly large, stretching out in all directions. It was the kind of darkness that made you feel small. Then the silence broke. A branch snapped. Not a small twig, but something heavier. I turned toward the sound. It had come from the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. I squinted, but the trees were nothing more than black shapes against the night sky. Another crunch. Closer this time. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. Probably a deer. Maybe a bear. I reminded myself that animals passed through these woods all the time. It wasn't unusual. Still, I went inside and locked the door. I woke up sometime past midnight, heart pounding. Something had woken me. I held my breath, listening. The generator was still running, a low hum beneath everything else. The fire in the stove had burned down, leaving the cabin in near darkness. I turned my head slowly toward the window. The curtains were thin, barely blocking the outside. The woods were still. Then, there it was again. A sound just outside the cabin. A slow, deliberate creak, like weight shifting on the porch. I sat up. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon sniffing around for food. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It hadn't been quick or careless. It had been slow, measured. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, clicking it on. A weak yellow beam cut across the room. I slid out of bed, moving as quietly as I could toward the front door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. Then another noise. This time, it wasn't the porch. It was behind the cabin. A deep, shuffling sound, like boots dragging across dirt. I felt a chill roll down my spine. Someone was out there. I grabbed the rifle my uncle had left in the cabin, flicked off the safety, and forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. If this was some lost hunter or a hiker who had wandered too far, they would call out. They'd knock. But whoever was out there wasn't doing that. They were circling. I heard another crunch of leaves, moving toward the left side of the cabin. Then silence. I stood there, frozen, waiting. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing. I barely slept the rest of the night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The moment the sun rose, I threw on my boots and stepped outside. The forest looked different in the daylight, less intimidating, more familiar. I took a slow lap around the cabin. There were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. Large, deep imprints in the dirt, circling the cabin in an uneven path. Whoever had been out here hadn't approached the door. They had just walked around and around. My stomach twisted. I checked the clearing, scanning the trees for any movement. Nothing. But that didn't mean whoever had been here was gone. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, shut off the generator, and locked the cabin. My uncle could think whatever he wanted. I wasn't going to sit alone in the woods, waiting to see if whoever had been watching me would come back. I threw my bag in the truck, climbed in, and started the engine. As I turned onto the dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him, a figure standing just inside the tree line. He was too far to make out clearly, but I knew he was looking at me, standing still, watching. I pressed the gas, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back.